Maxime scanned the gathered mercenaries, his brow furrowing. Just where are Terry and Piedro? Why aren't they here? A brief silence followed, broken by quiet chuckles and knowing smirks. Ernest raised an amused eyebrow. Let's just say they celebrated their victory a little too hard. They're probably still buried in a pile of hay somewhere, snoring away. Maxime closed his eyes for a moment, caught between irritation and amusement.
Fine.
Someone go wake them up.
Now.
A cold draft seemed to pass over the group. No one had ever dared miss one of Maxime's briefings before. The mercenaries exchanged glances, wondering what kind of hell awaited Terry and Piedro for their absence. Despite the tension, mischievous grins appeared on a few faces. Those two were in for a rude awakening.
Laura, smirking, stepped forward. Leave it to me, boss.
I'm counting on you. With an easy confidence, she turned and headed for the barn, humming lightly. Waking Terry and Piedro wouldn't be an easy task, but it would certainly be entertaining. When she arrived, she found them exactly as expected. Terry sprawled out in a mound of hay, a blissful grin on his face, while Piedro snored loudly, his arm wrapped possessively around an empty barrel. Shaking her head, Laura nudged them with her boot. Rise and shine, champions. The briefing's already started, and Maxime isn't exactly known for his patience. Terry groaned, squinting against the morning light as if it were personally attacking him. He rubbed his temples, clearly battling a pounding headache. Piedro cracked open one eye, muttered, "Just 5 more minutes." Then promptly let out a snore. Laura sighed. She had expected this. Without hesitation, she grabbed a nearby bucket of water and dumped it over their heads. Terry let out a strangled yelp, bolting upright like a startled cat. Piedro sputtered, flailing as he tried, and failed to stand.
All right. We're up.
No need to drown us. Terry protested, shaking himself off like a wet dog. Piedro glared at Laura, dripping and miserable. You really went that far? What the hell, Laura?
Laura smirked.
As far as I can tell, that barrel you're cuddling isn't a woman. And trust me, a bucket of water is a mercy compared to keeping Maxime waiting. Terry and Piedro exchanged looks. Reality hit. Damn it, Terry muttered, scrambling to grab his gear. They rushed to join the others, their wet clothes clinging to them uncomfortably. The moment they arrived, they were met with a sea of amused smirks and barely suppressed laughter. Maxime stood in front of them, arms crossed, expression unreadable, except for the slight glint of amusement in his eyes. "Ah, the latecomers finally grace us with their presence," he said dryly. Terry and Piedro stood stiffly, waiting for their punishment. Maxime let them stew in silence for a moment before speaking. "As punishment, you'll be washing the entire group's clothes. I expect them cleaned and dried by evening." Terry and Piedro exhaled in relief. That was far lighter than they had expected. "Yes, Chief," they said in unison, visibly embarrassed as their comrades chuckled around them. Maxime then turned to address the group. "Make sure you're prepared by this afternoon.
We leave at dawn.
Check your weapons, restock your supplies, and be ready. This mission won't be easy, one distraction could mean death." The light-hearted atmosphere faded. The mercenaries nodded, their expressions turning serious. They knew that the days ahead would be nothing like the celebration of the night before. With the orders given, they dispersed throughout the village, gathering supplies and making their final preparations. Some of the villagers assisted them, sharing quiet words and bits of advice with the mercenaries who had trained them in self-defense the previous night. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Maxime found himself alone, watching the sunset. The colors reminded him of blood. A noise behind him made him turn. A group of villagers stood nearby, watching him with hesitant yet determined expressions. Among them were Garin and Lyra, looking particularly uneasy. Maxime studied them silently, waiting. Garin finally took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Maxime, we've come to join your mercenary group." Maxime didn't respond immediately. He weighed the consequences, the risks. "If you come with us, you're going to die fighting orcs. That's almost a certainty." A villager named Jean stepped forward, his face set with grim resolve. "We've already lost everything," he said. "Our parents, our siblings, our children, they're all gone." Maxime clenched his jaw. He knew the orcs had slaughtered many families, wiping out entire bloodlines. But he hadn't realized just how many of these people had been left with nothing. Garen's eyes burned with conviction. "We're not fighting for revenge. We're fighting so no one else has to suffer the way we did." Maxime remained unconvinced. "Then why not join Baron Edrin's soldiers? You'd be safer there than with us. Lyra scoffed, crossing her arms. Because they're useless. They showed up days after the attack began. You can't trust someone who doesn't even know what's happening in their own lands. And I refuse to believe a baron is that unaware, she added bitterly.
Maxime sighed. They were right.
These weren't reckless fools seeking vengeance. They were survivors, determined to prevent more tragedies. He made his decision.
Fine.
The villagers straightened, hope flashing in their eyes. But you won't be paid until we return to the north, where most of our mercenaries are based, he warned.
Garin nodded.
We've always worked to survive, not for money. That answer was enough to lift the last of Maxime's doubts. Then welcome to the saber-toothed tigers, our mercenary group.
Ding.
12 villagers have expressed a wish to join your mercenary group. Would you like to accept them? Maxime mentally confirmed.
Ding.
Recruitment condition met. All 12 villagers are now mercenaries. He ignored the glowing system notifications, instead focusing on his new recruits. His eyes flicked over their profiles. Garin, 3-star potential.
Berserker talent.
Physique, 1.2. Lyra, 3-star potential.
Affinity with shadows. Physique, 0.9. Jean, 2-star potential.
Blessing of the Wind. Physique, 1.0. Katarina, 2-star potential.
Physique, 0.8. Retta, 2-star potential. Physique, 1.1. Yvonne, 2-star potential. Physique, 0.9.
His brows rose. Incredible. So many powerful talents, hidden among common villagers. Without his intervention, they might have lived and died without ever realizing their potential. Would this world even exist without me?
He pushed the thought aside.
What mattered was that he had stumbled upon a stroke of luck. Garin and Lyra had the potential to surpass Andrew. Jean could become as strong as Rodrigo or Romuald. Still, he kept this knowledge to himself. Let them fight and train without the burden of expectation. At that moment, the 12 new recruits stiffened. They could feel something changing within them, though they couldn't yet understand what. Don't panic, Maxime reassured them. That's just my talent affecting your bodies.
Lyra frowned. Your talent.
After Maxime's words, the new mercenaries dispersed, preparing for their first true journey into the unknown. Maxime remained in place for a moment longer, his gaze drifting to the horizon. He took in the beauty of the evening sky, a fleeting moment of peace before the march ahead. That night, the mercenaries shared a final meal with the villagers. Unlike the raucous celebrations of the previous night, a subdued silence hung over the gathering. Everyone seemed to sense that this village's tranquility might be the last they would experience for a long time.
Departure at dawn.
As the first light of dawn barely kissed the horizon, Maxime's firm voice roused his men. They donned their gear in silence, tension thick in the air. Among them, the 12 new recruits exchanged glances filled with a mix of determination and excitement. This was their first step toward something greater. Maxime, impassive as ever, observed them, reading their faces as though he could glimpse their thoughts. After a moment, he motioned to Ernest and Andrew. Get them equipped. Use whatever we have, even if it's makeshift. We're not here for a parade. The 2 mercenaries nodded and led the recruits to a small shelter, hastily built during their short stay. Inside were a dozen swords, 3 axes, and 2 pairs of daggers. It was a meager selection, but it was to be expected. Mercenaries traveled light, carrying only what they could on their backs. Garin's eyes were drawn to a heavy, thick sword. As if compelled, he seized it, lifting it with both hands. The weapon felt unwieldy at first, but something about it resonated with him. He tightened his grip, determined to master it. Lyra, on the other hand, gravitated toward a pair of daggers, twirling them between her fingers with natural ease.
Jean, however, hesitated.
None of the weapons before him felt right. Instead, his gaze kept drifting to the bow strapped to Ernest's back. You want to learn the bow? Ernest asked, noticing his lingering stare.
Yes.
Ernest scratched the back of his head, looking conflicted. Listen, in this world, archers aren't respected. Most people see them as cowards, striking from a distance, running before they can be caught. If you choose this path, you won't be as strong in direct combat, and you'll be looked down on, unless you become strong enough that no one dares to despise you. Jean didn't waver.
I understand.
And I still choose the bow.
Ernest sighed. All right.
I'll lend you my spare shortbow. But take a sword as well, for when you have no choice but to fight up close. Jean nodded, grateful his request was granted. The other recruits hesitated, experimenting with different weapons before settling on long swords, the standard choice for those without clear specialties.
From a distance, Maxime watched.
Could it be that people with talent instinctively know what suits them best? The thought lingered before he brushed it aside. There was still much about this world and its systems that remained a mystery.
A risk worth taking.
As the recruits adjusted to their new weapons, Maxime joined Rodrigo and Romuald, who had been observing from afar. Romuald crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. "We're taking a risk, Maxime. Bringing them with us."
Maxime nodded. Yes.
"But it's a calculated risk. Some of them have exceptional potential. I didn't take them in out of pity." Rodrigo and Romuald exchanged a glance.
Exceptional how?
Romuald asked, curiosity piqued.
Maxime smirked.
"Not quite at Charles's, Henry's or Altia's level, but they'll surpass most mercenaries, including you two." Rodrigo and Romuald blinked in surprise before grinning.
Good, Romuald chuckled.
Stronger comrades mean a stronger group, and a better chance of survival. Shortly after, the saber-toothed tigers, now reinforced by 12 new recruits, prepared to leave. A solemn hush fell as they fastened the last of their gear. Maxime raised his arm, signaling the departure. As they set off, the villagers of Ventebois gathered to bid them farewell. "Come back and visit us anytime. If you're ever in the area again, don't hesitate to rest here." Some mercenaries raised their hands in farewell.
Garin. A villager called out.
"Don't do anything reckless. Stay alive." Garin grinned, raising his fist to the sky.
"I'll survive. Count on it."
"Lyra, Terry, try not to make too much noise at night," another villager teased.
"And don't go having kids too soon," someone else shouted.
Terry and Lyra, coincidentally standing beside each other, immediately stiffened, embarrassment washing over them. But Terry recovered quickly, flashing a cocky grin.
"Don't worry.
I'll make sure Lyra stays safe." The villagers erupted in cheers and whistles, delighted by his response. "Jean, make sure you survive too. When you return, we'll throw a grand feast."
Jean laughed. "Count me in. Drinks on me."
Suddenly, a child's voice rang out loud and clear. "So the world can burn, but Jean's booze is sacred." Laughter erupted as the boy's mother dragged him away by the ear, scolding him on the spot. Even the departing mercenaries chuckled, their spirits lightened.
The journey begins.
As the mercenaries marched, the contrast between the veterans and the recruits was clear. Time passed quickly. The experienced fighters shared advice with the newcomers, teaching them the basics of survival. They took short breaks, allowing the former villagers' bodies to adapt. By nightfall, Lyra, Garin, and Jean were utterly exhausted. They camped without a fire, wary of attracting orcs. Dinner was simple, dried meat and bread. Despite their exhaustion, the new recruits lay awake, their minds filled with restless thoughts.
Except for Garin.
He was snoring within minutes. The next morning, the saber-toothed tigers advanced across an open plain. Tension crept into the air.
There were no places to hide, no cover.
If an enemy spotted them, there would be no avoiding a fight. Maxime led at the front, flanked by Andrew and Romuald. Henry, Altia, Terry, and James guarded the rear. The new mercenaries marched in the middle, protected by their more experienced comrades. Soon, they entered a valley thick with vegetation.
Jean stiffened.
A subtle movement in the tall grass caught his attention.
"Hey, Garin."
"I think I saw something move," he whispered.
Garin glanced at him, unconcerned. "Relax."
If there was really something there, the stronger mercenaries would have noticed. Jean wasn't reassured.
He knew what he saw.
Taking a deep breath, he broke formation, sprinting toward Maxime. The sudden movement startled everyone. Jean reached Maxime's side, lowering his voice. "Something's moving in the grass."
"To our right."
Maxime's expression didn't change. But he raised his hand. The saber-toothed tigers stopped instantly. Silence fell. Every eye scanned the landscape. Maxime knew Jean's talent. His instincts weren't to be ignored. Garin swallowed hard, gripping his sword tightly. The tension in the air became suffocating. Then, without warning, a hoarse, guttural cry rang out. Then another. And another. The tall grass erupted as creatures burst forth from all sides.
Orcs. 50 of them.
Muscles taut, eyes gleaming with savage hunger. The saber-toothed tigers were surrounded. And the battle had begun.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Hold the line, shouted Maxime, sword in hand, keeping an impassive face with piercing eyes. The orcs charged, brandishing crude but formidable weapons. Garin, despite the fear knotting his stomach, brandished his sword with determination. "What are you doing, rookie? Stay at the training center." A deafening voice came from behind Garin. The next moment he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned his head and saw a red-haired young man watching the orcs as if they were watching his prey. "Continue reading stories on my virtual library empire. You're not backing out again?"
Ah, yes, of course.
Garin and the other recruits were surrounded and protected by the experienced mercenaries. With their ordinary physiques, they could get killed by the orcs in one fell swoop. Shortly afterwards, the first lines of orcs pounced on them with relentless brutality, and soon the sound of weapons mingled with the war cries and growls of the creatures. Jean, positioned in the center with the short bow Ernest had entrusted to him, tried to keep calm. He inhaled deeply, bracing his bow. The first arrow went off, striking an orc in the chest and lightly piercing the creature's thick skin. Unfortunately, due to the lack of power, it failed to reach the creature's vital organs. But a victorious smile played on his lips as he managed to hit the target where he wanted. He really felt a disconcerting ease to aim and shoot where he aimed when he was holding that bow. Even he was surprised, feeling that the world was wrong to despise the bow. In his opinion, if every human could have a bow, the threat from orcs could be drastically reduced. He just didn't know that he was the one who was special. For ordinary people, picking up an arrow and cocking the bow was complicated enough. Shooting correctly was good enough in the beginning. However, asking a beginner for precision was like asking an ordinary villager to kill an orc with a simple sword. The difficulty was very high indeed. Back on the battlefield, mercenaries with less than 2 physics points had some difficulty fending off the orcs. Due to the lack of space, none of them could use their agility as they had done in the village. As a result, they found themselves wounded and outnumbered. Only Maxime could easily block the orcs' attacks, but he couldn't kill them, because every time a gap opened up, an orc would attack Maxime, forcing him into a defensive position. He did, however, notice Jean at the rear, aiming his arrows with an impressive calm for a novice, and a glint of approval shone in his eyes. On the other hand, Ernest had dropped his bow and had long since drawn his sword to reinforce the mercenary's defensive position. Unfortunately, he underestimated the strength of the orc in front of him, who was attacking him, and ended up clumsily parrying a sword blow. The orc's brute force almost caused him to drop his sword and suffer a direct and serious injury. Rodrigo sprang up beside him and with one swift blow, pushed the orc back using his body. "Ernest, keep your concentration." But the orcs continued to pour in, and the mercenaries struggled to maintain their formation. Laura and Andrew fought hard, trying to maintain a solid front to protect the new recruits. However, despite their valiant efforts, the line was eventually breached, and a massive orc managed to infiltrate, rushing towards Jean in particular with a terrifying roar. Caught off guard, Jean stepped back, his bow useless against the imposing creature. But just as the orc raised his axe to cut it down, a figure appeared from nowhere. Garin, armed with his heavy sword, lunged forward and interposed himself, repelling the orc with a powerful thrust of his blade. Out of breath but determined, he smiled briefly at Jean. "This is no time for daydreaming, Jean." Jean nodded, grateful, and immediately resumed his shooting, covered by his friend. Obviously, Garin's strength was still very much lacking, so the orc was only slightly pushed back a few steps and could quickly come back. Fortunately, Terry, who had unwittingly let the orc penetrate their circle, quickly came up behind him and pierced his head with a swift sword thrust. The orc naturally fell to the ground before the stunned eyes of the new mercenaries. Lyra, who had been observing the scene closely, felt her heart quicken all at once. "He's so beautiful," she murmured without realizing it. Terry quickly returned to Pietro, Tenna and Charles, the closest mercenaries fighting with him. His absence had quickly caused an outburst. "That was hot there, Terry, don't do that again," exclaimed Tenna in a cold sweat. "If you could stop flirting on the battlefield, that would be great," commented Pietro with a light laugh. Terry shook his head amused with his physique. Although he couldn't notice Lyra's words, he could see her shining eyes looking at him. But he quickly refocused, his life and that of his comrades was at stake. As the battle raged on, the mercenaries grew more and more tired, but held their ground. Only Terry had managed to kill an orc, and 49 orcs remained, most of them only slightly wounded. In a 20 versus 49 situation, the situation was really starting to become critical. "Henry, be careful." A powerful high-pitched voice cut through the small group of mercenaries. It was Altia, who had just screamed at the top of his lungs when he saw that an orc had started swinging his axe into Henry's blind spot and that no one could block it for him. The latter, being an apprentice knight with solid skills and having already had systematic training, had very good reflexes. So, as soon as he heard Altia's cry, he immediately detected the danger and managed to block the axe. No, there's another one, Henry. Henry had also noticed that a smaller orc had snuck up on him and taken advantage of his weakness to attack. With all his strength already invested in defending himself against the orc with the axe, he had absolutely no way of striking back in this situation. What the hell?
Shit.
A dagger had just pierced Henry's light armor and blood began to spurt everywhere.
Nun.
Altia screamed loudly and began to unleash her extraordinary strength. She managed to push back all the orcs in front of her and rushed towards Henry, who was still in a contest of strength with the axe-wielding orc despite his wound. The hole she had left was quickly filled by Andrew, Rodrigo and 2 other experienced mercenaries nearby. Miserable human, what are you going to do? Surprisingly, a hoarse voice came from the little orc who had just planted Henry. Of course, the term little orc was relative, as he was still the size of a normal human. And in theory, all orcs could speak the human language, but very few invested any effort in learning it. The vast majority spent their time training, mating and hunting. He looked at Altia with a smirk and blocked her path. Get out of the little green shit. The fierce Altia went straight for the little orc and attacked with a broadsword thrust. But the latter gave a slight mocking smile in response. These humans are always so stupid. He easily avoided the broadsword thrust before Altia's stunned eyes, and began an attack aimed at Altia's neck. If he succeeded, Altia would undoubtedly be decapitated. Damn it, Maxime, I told you it was a bad idea to bring recruits with us. Now look at the situation our elites find themselves in. Simultaneously, Rodrigo arrived at the little orc's side and swung a violent kick at him, sending him flying for a few meters. However, he was not particularly hurt. On Henry's side, Izo arrived and attacked the orc blocking Henry, forcing him backwards. Are you all right, Henry? Asked Rodrigo worriedly. He wanted to say he was fine, but he suddenly dropped to one knee and put his left hand on his wound.
He felt extremely weak.
An incessant stream of blood flowed onto the floor. Everyone could see that in the blood was a strange green matter. New mercenaries such as Garen, Lyra and Jean looked on in fear. The other mercenaries kept their composure, but looked grim. The dagger was poisoned, Henry murmured with a bitter smile. As if in revenge, the fighting against the orcs intensified. But Maxime knew that this renewed intensity would not last long. Seeing that the outcome of the battle was becoming increasingly negative, he made a decision. Nox limit, activate. A powerful energy coursed through the bodies of all the mercenaries, making them stronger, more agile, more enduring and improving their thinking abilities. Suddenly, the entire battlefield was turned upside down. Experienced mercenaries who had previously been in trouble could now easily fend off the orcs and even kill them. Maxime, before the shocked eyes of the former villagers, began to exude an almost tangible aura. Maxime took advantage of this to decapitate 3 orcs who had been bothering him for a while, at lightning speed. With his talent bonus, he had over 4 physical points, making him as strong as any knight in the kingdom. A few new mercenaries were able to catch a glimpse of the scene. Is it still human to do this? Muttered one of them in disbelief. On the other hand, Andrew went slightly mad with joy, as if changing personality, and began a massacre in the ranks of the orcs. Ha 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 ha, I've missed this feeling of being filled with power. Raucous cries began to echo throughout the valley. That's better, Chief. Rodrigo complained slightly, but he was happy. At the same time, he and Altia looked at the little orc with mischievous eyes. Since when can humans be so powerful? The little orc was incredulous. In his tribe, he was always told the humans were extremely weak, and that he should only be wary of humans dressed in metal. His shock was compounded when he saw his first victims stand up as if nothing had happened. Henry felt particularly good at that moment, as if he'd just come back to life. His sense of weakness had completely disappeared. Instead, he had never felt so powerful. He first decapitated the orc who had attacked him in a blind spot, then kept an eye on the little orc. Leave him to me, I'll take care of him personally, he said, looking at Rodrigo and Altia. Both nodded and stepped back. Maxime, who had had time to kill a dozen orcs, and seeing that the overall situation was under control, turned to Garen, Lyra and Jean, who were now shining particularly brightly.
You two can fight.
It'll give you your first combat experience. Seeing their leader still exuding a powerful aura, and with his now white, intimidating eyes fixed on them, they all had a renewed respect for their new leader. They understood why no one dared respond to Maxime's orders. Faced with a monster of such power, the thought of a negative response did not exist. After being stunned for a moment, Garin happily nodded with some excitement and rushed towards an orc attacking Pietro. Full of spirit, he let out a roar and swung his sword with increased power at the orc. But the latter blocked easily, to Garin's surprise. The orc, even with his low intelligence, felt it odd that this human should be so weak compared to the human he'd fought before. He began to emit continuous hoarse sounds. "Hey Garin, I think he's laughing at you," Lyra murmured with a smile. She had been discreetly following Garin as he charged without a clear plan. Simultaneously, an arrow flew into the orc's mouth and pierced his brain directly. "Stay tuned to my virtual library empire." This sent him plummeting to the ground, never to rise again. The two turned and saw Jean still holding the bow and pointing at it. But even he was surprised. "Don't look at me like that, even I didn't know that was possible." The other new recruits escaped from the center of the protective circle and began to help the experienced mercenaries. The new recruits, who temporarily had the physique of elite soldiers, were no longer as vulnerable to orcs as before. As the need to protect them disappeared, all the experienced mercenaries were able to let loose and show off their expertise. Some even took the time to give the new recruits a few pointers during the fight. On the other hand, the fight between the little orc and Henry was brutal and intense. Henry, wounded and poisoned, had almost lost his life, but thanks to the activation of Maxime's special power, his body was recovering very quickly. The little orc, quick and cunning, was still a threat. If his physique was calculated, he wouldn't be far off the 3-point mark. What's more, unlike the other orcs, his physique was very well balanced, with no obvious strengths or weaknesses. As he stood at a distance, watching the scene with calculating eyes, he analyzed Henry, now back on his feet and invigorated. Henry's muscles tensed as he slowly advanced towards his opponent. The little orc, armed with his poison-coated dagger, squinted his piercing black eyes, a look of contempt on his face. Not waiting for Henry to take the initiative, he ran towards him. His movements were agile, almost dance-like, contrasting with the brutality of the other orcs. "Don't think you can win just because you've resisted my poison, human," the orc growled, his hoarse voice echoing in the stale air of the plain. He circled around Henry, looking for an opening, while Henry kept his sword raised, ready to strike. Suddenly, the orc leapt at Henry's back, his dagger gleaming in the morning light. Henry reacted immediately and deflected the attack with his blade, creating a sparkle between the two weapons. But the little orc, far from being thrown off balance, used the momentum to slide to Henry's side and attempt a swift blow to his leg. Henry felt a sharp pain as the poison point grazed his thigh, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he seized the opportunity to swing a circular blow, forcing the orc to step back hastily, narrowly missing tripping over the corpse of another orc. "Is that all you got?" spat Henry, his jaw clenched, his eyes shining with determination. His muscles vibrated, fueled by the power of Maxime's talent. The little orc responded with a twisted smile, then charged again, this time with a series of swift, precise attacks. The sound of clashing blades intensified, each movement becoming a deadly dance. Henry managed to dodge and deflect the blows, but the orc continued relentlessly, his movements becoming more and more frenzied. Finally, Henry saw a gap. In the rush of the orc's overambitious attack, he dived, bringing his sword down with all his might. The little orc's face became a marvel to behold. The blade split the air and hit the orc in the shoulder. A wrenching cry of pain erupted from the creature's throat, and an expression of pure hatred contorted his face.
Yet he didn't fall.
With one last thrust, it tried to plunge its dagger into Henry's neck, clearly ready to die taking its opponent with it. But Henry, anticipating this move, pivoted and grabbed the orc's wrist with a powerful hand. The poisoned dagger hung trembling between them. Then Henry slowly brought his sword down one last time, driving the blade into the little orc's chest. Henry felt the strange sensation of the sword slowly piercing the orc's entire body. But he didn't feel any sense of disgust. Instead, he was still a little afraid. If it weren't for Maxime's talent, he'd be dead here today. Silence fell abruptly on the battlefield as the orc's body slowly collapsed, his now empty gaze still fixed on Henry. Panting, covered in sweat and blood, Henry sat up, his breath heavy but triumphant. Adrenaline was still pumping through his veins, and he turned his gloomy gaze on the rest of the mercenaries who continued to fight against the remaining orcs. Gradually, the orcs began to retreat, their ranks broken and their ferocity cooled by the mercenaries' might. Their green blood ran over the ground in much of the valley. Undoubtedly, these monsters were extremely robust, usually requiring several blows from an experienced mercenary to finish one off, and that was counting the bonus of Maxime's talent. Rodrigo and Romuald coordinated a final assault, finishing off any orcs who tried to flee. When calm returned, a heavy silence fell over the battlefield. The saber-toothed tigers, covered in sweat and blood, regrouped, counting their wounded. Maxime, standing in the center, glanced at his men, satisfied. Despite the difficulty of the ambush, his new mercenaries had stood their ground, had not run away and had even fought the orcs, proving their worth from the very first fight. He approached Garen, Lyra and Jean, who were still panting, their eyes shining with fatigue but also with a newfound pride. "You fought well," Maxime declared, his tone solemn. "But this is only the beginning." The three newcomers nodded, realizing that their lives had changed forever and that they were no longer ordinary villagers. The valley, littered with orc corpses, seemed quiet now. Everyone was quietly catching their breath, saying little. Maxime stepped into the middle of the mercenary group, his aura beginning to fade as he deactivated his talent, but the strong impression he gave off remained and drew everyone's gaze. He was also the only person who had no bloodstains on him and who hadn't had his armor damaged. "Don't forget to take the ears of these orcs as evidence in case the Count doesn't believe us, as we did at the village of Ventbois. Those ears are very valuable." Jean, who was particularly tired, suddenly had a bad feeling. "Chief, we'd better get out of here fast." Everyone looked at Jean suspiciously, including Maxime. Suddenly, a distant thud was heard. An eerie echo, like the steady beat of a giant drum. The silence that had pervaded the valley broke, replaced by a palpable tension. The mercenaries looked at each other, concern painting itself on their tired faces. Rodrigo frowned and turned to Maxime. "Chief, it looks like that was just the vanguard of an orc army." Maxime took a deep breath, watching the horizon where shadows were beginning to appear. A wave of larger, better-armed orcs was approaching. Andrew, frowning, stepped up beside Maxime.
"What do we do, boss?"
Maxime didn't hesitate and shook his head. "Obviously we're taking a detour, but confronting an army of orcs isn't part of our job. We'd be risking the loss of many mercenaries, and that's not the point. Everyone hurry up and grab the ears of these monsters and let's get the hell out of here." Maxime's loud voice roused the mercenaries from their worries, and everyone set about cutting off the ears and storing them in their bags. In less than a minute, Maxime's order was carried out and everyone started running towards the valley entrance. Scouts including Tenna and Altia were sent to the front to secure their route, while other mercenaries took up positions around the recruits to protect them in case of need. The footsteps of the orc army seemed farther and farther away, but no one felt safe. Jean approached Maxime, fear etched on his features. "Chief, I feel we're being followed." Jean's feelings were proving right every time for the moment, so Maxime decided to trust them and find a solution. Maxime looked around, searching the rugged landscape for an idea. Then he spotted a steep path winding up to a small rocky plateau, out of sight. "We should be able to hide up there," he said, pointing to the path. The mercenaries quickly deployed, each knowing that the slightest misstep could cost them their lives. The sun was already declining, turning the valley a dark, oppressive red. The rumble of orc footsteps echoed once again, louder than before. A pungent smell of blood and death spread through the valley. A few minutes passed, and the orc scouts finally arrived. There were only about 30 of them, but they seemed stronger than the vanguard they had faced. These orcs also seemed to possess certain skills. Maxime and the mercenaries could see from their position as they stopped near the corpses, wary expressions on their faces. A few of them sniffed the air, analyzing the mutilated bodies. Among them was a strange orc. This orc was small, wore a strange black robe and had a bent back. From his position, Maxime couldn't see his face, but somehow he sensed an intense feeling of danger coming from this orc. This orc approached one of the orcs killed by Maxime, and used his clawed fingers to graze the corpse's still fresh wound. Then he put the green blood he'd collected via his fingers into his mouth, as if that might give him some clue. He muttered something in an unfamiliar language, his eyes crinkling in cold anger. When he noticed that the orc's ears were missing, he became even angrier, muttering something to the orcs accompanying him. Charles, who, like everyone else, was watching every move from his hiding place, felt the tension rising inside him. The new recruits weren't in the best of moods either. The slightest clue found by these orcs could give them away. The mercenaries remained perfectly still, their chests barely heaving with controlled breathing. The orcs began to inspect the area, stirring up the corpses and looking for traces. Maxime frowned, his mind racing to anticipate their actions. He knew that if the trackers picked up their trail, their position might be discovered. If they really were discovered, then most of the mercenaries here would undoubtedly die. Just as an unbearable tension was building up, an unexpected movement turned the tide. Further down, crows, attracted by the fresh flesh of the orcs, began cawing and fighting over a corpse, creating a commotion that diverted the orcs' attention. The trackers looked up and exchanged glances before grunting in annoyance. The shaman, clearly disconcerted, made a curt gesture, ordering the troop to continue their march towards the valley's exit. The main army soon reached the saber-toothed tiger's position. Almost all the mercenaries began to sweat profusely as they saw the endless column of orcs. Maxime could tell that there were at least 500 orcs in this army. Such an army would be enough to take down any baron's territory, especially as there were several particularly large orcs in this army. Generally speaking, the bigger the orcs, the stronger they were. If they were smaller than average, then they were generally more intelligent than others and could possess special abilities. This was what was taught in real-world courses. All beginners had to face orcs at one time or another. Some even chose to fight them from the start, because they couldn't bear the thought of killing human beings. But these beginners usually met with a bad end, as their physical strength was far too inadequate to survive against the monstrous force of the orcs. Find more to read at my virtual library empire. In any case, given their size, these large orcs should be able to rival knights, at least in terms of sheer strength. Including the mysterious orc, it was a force not to be underestimated. The hidden mercenaries watched in silence as the army passed beneath them. The steady beat of the orc march eventually faded into the distance, leaving the valley to fall back into an almost unreal silence. Rodrigo exhaled slowly, his muscles finally relaxing. Henry glanced at Maxime, who was still surveying the terrain, ready to react to the slightest contingency. "That was hot, boss," Henry murmured. Maxime nodded, his gaze as piercing as ever. "Yes, but we'll have to keep moving. Those corpses won't lie forever." He turned his head towards the mercenaries. "Get ready, we're leaving in 5 minutes. Let's leave no trace." The men and women of the group rose cautiously, erasing their footprints and ensuring that their passage would remain invisible. Daylight was fading, and darkness would soon become their ally as they moved away from the valley that had become the graveyard of a battle that could have become their graveyard. Daylight was fading, and darkness would soon become their ally as they moved away from the valley that had become the graveyard of a battle that could have become their graveyard. The group set off again, twilight enveloping them in its protective shadow. The mercenaries advanced cautiously along the steep path leading down from their hiding place, each step calculated not to betray their presence. The smell of blood and death, which had permeated the valley, seemed to follow them like a sinister shadow. Tenna and Altia took their temporary role as scouts to heart, carefully observing the road that wound through the dense forest leading to Lappi. If an orc army had passed through the valley, it meant that the situation in the south was far more serious than anyone thought. Even Lappi could be in danger at this rate. The silence was heavy, and the rustling of leaves seemed louder than ever. Every crack of a branch beneath their feet made their hearts beat a little faster. Suddenly, a whisper pierced the darkness. It was Jean, walking alongside Andrew. "Those orcs, Andrew. What was that being in black robes? I've heard of orc shamans before, but I've never seen anyone so sinister." Andrew shook his head, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the last rays of daylight were fading. "I don't know, I was just a simple villager a few months ago. But if this being is a shaman, then he must have powers that even we can't understand." His gaze wandered for a moment, searching the growing darkness for an explanation. "After all, our captain possesses powers that are more than mysterious and, above all, very powerful. He must have other individuals in the world with powers just as powerful." This did little to reassure Jean, who felt he was venturing into a world far too dangerous for a former simple villager like himself. Henry, standing nearby, also frowned. To be honest, as an apprentice knight he'd never experienced any great battles or mysterious events. He'd simply been on patrol, and sometimes enjoyed abusing his good looks to break up brawls in town and impress the ladies. This gesture often worked, and thanks to it he had known many women in bed. But the Battle of Plauta profoundly changed his mentality, and made him feel weak in the face of world events that might come his way.
He felt in danger.
That was why he had decided to betray Baron Irit and join Maxime's mercenary group. Deep down, despite his gentle mask, he had an enormous desire for power and strength. But with one danger after another, he felt even more uneasy than before. Perhaps I should have stayed quietly by Baron Irit's side and trained quietly while enjoying the pleasure of life. But he immediately shook his head with firm eyes to clear these thoughts. A strong man grows in adversity. I normally had little hope of becoming a knight, but now it's a sure thing as long as I survive. Maybe one day I can even become a great knight.
A great knight.
What an honor that would be. Henry's eyes firmed, filled with new resolve and without the slightest trace of fear. He wasn't the only one with doubts. Most of the mercenaries had many questions about the choice they'd made in joining Maxime. Some reassured themselves in the same way as Henry, telling themselves that they would become powerful in the future, while others thought that saving lives was worth risking one's own and living for. On the other hand, Maxime paused for a moment to check that the group was keeping up. His face, usually impassive, was taut with worry. He hadn't thought that by going south, he'd be exposing his elite mercenaries to so much danger. Especially now that his talent couldn't be reactivated in the next 7 days, or he'd suffer a soul injury. This kind of injury was extremely complicated to heal. Fortunately, he had already obtained a map of the kingdom from Baron Irit, which also showed the southern region. He had long since memorized the geographical location of the southern territory. "We'll reach the first village before nightfall," he announced. "Let's hope the roads to Lappy are safe." But hope at this moment seemed a luxury. As they descended the hillside and entered deeper into the forest, the mercenaries felt the atmosphere change. The birds, still singing faintly, fell silent, and the gentle night wind became a colder, more oppressive breeze. At last, they reached the first village. It was a modest hamlet, where the bleating of sheep and the laughter of children should have been heard. Instead, a suffocating smell greeted them. Charred houses rose up, and scattered corpses lay in postures frozen by the horrors they had seen before they died. The dying flames of the fires cast flickering shadows, bringing nightmarish scenes to life. Garin, his face pale, rushed into some nearby bushes and vomited his guts out. And he wasn't the only one. Of the 12 new recruits, 7 couldn't stop themselves from vomiting. Maxime frowned as Laura stood next to him with a very pale face. "So this is what would have happened if we hadn't gone to rescue the village of Ventbois." Laura's words surprised the new recruits, not realizing that their village could have ended up in the same state as this hamlet. It was fortunate that, despite the loss of their families, they still had a place to return to. Maxime remained silent for a moment, absorbing the scene before him. He clenched his fists, his eyes hardening. The troop moved cautiously through the ruins, avoiding debris and signs of struggle. The atmosphere weighed on them, like an invisible hand clutching their chests. The new recruits tried to avert their eyes from the mutilated bodies, while the mercenaries who had been through several battles already guided them with a grave air. Tenna came running back, sweating. Since the battle with the orcs, they'd had no rest, running in every direction and paying attention to everything. This constant vigilance was tiring everyone. "I spotted some orc scouts nearby, probably looking for survivors or securing the area."
Maxime nodded.
"Pick up the pace, and don't make any noise." They would have liked to bury these people, but the energy required and the danger hanging over them made the action too risky. They silently left the ruined village, passing through a forest to reach Lappy more quickly. Once through this forest, they would finally reach Lappy in less than 10 minutes. Bypassing it would waste too much time and could present a greater danger. What's more, the forest offered several advantages. Read exclusive chapters at my virtual library Empire. They would be hard to spot, and its large surface area made it difficult to set up ambushes. If a battle were to take place, this battlefield would also be conducive to them, as they could fully utilize their agility and use the environment as a force. On the contrary, orcs accustomed to wide, strong movement won't be able to use all their strength here because of the environment. Darkness thickened around them, but the glow of Lappy, the central city, already appeared to them as the promise of a last refuge, and a hope as fragile as the flame of a candle ready to flicker. The mercenaries advanced at a steady pace, their senses always on the alert. Only the occasional creak of branches beneath their feet and the rustle of wind in the trees disturbed the oppressive calm of the forest. The stars, tiny points of light, timidly pierced the dark sky, but were not enough to dispel the growing darkness. Jean, at the rear of the group, was casting worried glances behind him. The vision of the ruined village and its corpses remained etched in his mind, an image he knew he'd find hard to shake off. Rodrigo, walking beside him, murmured in a husky voice, "Do you think they're already on our trail? Those scouts, they were so close." Jean replied, his gaze fixed and his jaw clenched. "I don't know, but I have a feeling we're not out of danger yet." A palpable tension spread through the group. Even those who hadn't heard the exchange felt the growing nervousness. In the lead, Maxime scanned the road, his beady eyes searching for the slightest sign of movement. His left hand rested firmly on his sheath, as if to tell himself that his sword was still there and would defend him if anything happened. His left hand rested firmly on his sheath, as if to say to himself that his sword was still there and would defend him if anything happened. In the lead, Maxime scanned the road, his keen eyes searching for the slightest sign of movement. His silhouette stood out from the shadows, imposing and determined. He knew that the survival of his mercenaries depended on his ability to stay one step ahead of the menace that was chasing them. The narrow path they took wound through a dense pine forest. Low branches clung to their clothes, as if trying to hold them back. Altia abruptly returned to them, her face taut with worry.
"Chief, we've got to stop."
"I heard suspicious noises up ahead. It could be an orc patrol." Maxime thought for a moment, weighing the risk of stopping against the risk of being ambushed.
All right, halt here.
Everyone, complete silence and camouflage yourselves behind the trees and bushes. The mercenaries obeyed, slipping silently into the darkness, muscles tense. Every breath was light, and every heart beat at a frenetic pace. Silence fell again, heavy and oppressive, interrupted only by the distant song of an owl. A rustle, this time much closer, made Lyra jump. She wasn't one to be easily frightened, but the darkness of the night combined with the constant pressure of the orcs made her weak. She tightened her grip on her dagger, ready for anything. A sharp crack sounded nearby, followed by a hoarse growl. Altia had been right, orcs were approaching, and there was no time to run, as the orcs would immediately notice their presence and could call for reinforcements. Heavy, irregular footsteps drew closer, accompanied by grunts and choppy words in a language only orcs could master. A group of half a dozen emerged from the thicket. Their torches cast a moving glow over their bestial faces and rough skin. Each carried improvised weapons, marked by the dried blood of their previous victims. Maxime raised his hand, a signal for all to stand still. He held his breath, his gaze fixed on the patrol's movements. A drop of cold sweat trickled down his temple. If one of them made the slightest noise, it could be the start of a long, hard battle. Now that he could no longer use his talent, if they were to encounter an orc that was a little too strong, or too many orcs, he could really have many casualties among his mercenaries. He was particularly worried about Charles. Discover exclusive tales on my virtual library empire. This guy was his mercenary with the most potential. He could become as strong as a knight in the next few months given enough time. Not to mention his talent, which would still come in handy in a few years' time. Unfortunately, he was only an apprentice knight at the entry stage at last count. In 1 versus 1 against an orc he could manage, but if he faced an orc's power head-on without defending himself, he could die instantly. Charles himself was aware of this situation, but he knew that a strong man couldn't grow like a flower in a greenhouse. Only by forging oneself through hardship could one truly become a strong man, both physically and mentally. Otherwise, even if he could have the physique of a knight, he'd be the weakest of them all. By the way, let's see his physique right now. System, show me Charles's stats.
Ding.
Mercenary statistics being calculated.
Ding.
Statistics calculated. Would you like to see the statistics for the mercenary Charles? Yes, that's what I asked you to do. The system was a little too mechanical for his taste, but there wasn't much Maxime could do about it. Request received, display of Charles's statistics in progress. Charles, 4-star potential, affinity with dragons.
Physique, 2.4. Incredible.
He went from 2.1 points to 2.4 points in such a short time. I understand better why he recovers so quickly each time. The 4-star potential is really scary, he really does get stronger with each battle. Suddenly, he blinked away all the notifications that had been displayed in front of him as he saw something strange and prepared to react to any situation. The blackness of night returned completely. One of the orcs, more massive than the others and obviously their leader, stopped and sniffed the air with suspicion. His yellow eyes roamed the forest, as if he could sense their invisible presence. His companions whispered among themselves, tense. The mercenaries' hearts were beating so fast that they felt as if the sound of their beats echoed through the night. But the orc leader, after a moment that seemed like an eternity, let out a growl and turned away, signaling the others to continue their march towards the ruined village. Maxime waited for the torchlight to fade into the distance before straightening slightly, his muscles finally relaxed. He exchanged a glance with Rodrigo, who nodded, relieved but still on the alert. We'll keep going, but stay close together. We need to reach Lappy before dawn. The mercenaries set off again, the anxiety of the encounter strengthening their resolve. The mercenaries finally emerged from the dense forest, and the sight before them gave rise to a rare sense of relief. Lappy stood proudly before them, protected by solid white stone ramparts and imposing towers that seemed to watch over the county of Ravemont. There was no sign of fire or chaos to mar this vision. On the contrary, lit torches and lanterns hanging from the walls radiated a warm, welcoming glow. The town seemed inviolable, a bastion of peace in the midst of tormented lands. An emotional silence fell over the group, as everyone felt the weight of tension gradually dissipate. Maxime cast a calculating glance at the sturdy walls, looking for signs of weakness that might indicate a recent assault, but found none. Lappy, the pearl of Ravemont County, had remained untouched by the wave of violence that had swept through the surrounding villages. "Here we are," murmured Henry, looking almost incredulous. "Lappy is intact." The mercenaries exchanged knowing glances, fatigue and fear giving way to a semblance of comfort. Jean looked up at the ramparts and saw guards in full armor watching over the plain around the city. Their discipline and vigilance reinforced the impression of absolute security that Lappi exuded. The main entrance, protected by an iron portcullis, was illuminated and guarded by alert-looking soldiers, their spears gleaming in the torchlight. The group slowly approached the gate. The mercenaries, exhausted and bearing the scars of their recent battle, caught the eyes of the sentries. One of the guards, an imposing-looking captain, stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his sword. "Who goes there?" he asked, his voice low but devoid of hostility. Maxime took a step forward, raising his voice to reply. "We're the Saber-Toothed Tigers, a group of mercenaries from the north to help the south resist the orc invasion. We've come to bring back battle merits for the Count." The captain squinted, examining the tired faces of the group, wondering if young men like them could really bring back battle merits. Because that meant they'd managed to kill orcs. Especially as many of them looked like ordinary armed villagers. But this also reassured him, because he didn't think that 30 or so people like them could cause the slightest wave of chaos in Lappi. "Welcome to Lappi. Come in, and rest assured you're safe here." The portcullis lifted with a deep creak, and the mercenaries entered the city, welcomed by the light and bustle of the night. Cobbled streets stretched out before them, lined with stone houses and still-open stores, where the smell of warm bread and fragrant stew wafted through the air. Laughter and conversation rose up from the taverns, a sign that life continued fearlessly within the ramparts. For the first time in days, the mercenaries allowed themselves a sigh of relief. Lappi, Count Arden's walled city, was an unexpected sanctuary, a haven of tranquility in stark contrast to the horrors they had left behind. Maxime paused for a moment, observing the vibrant city, and murmured to himself, "For how much longer?" Maxime paused for a moment, watching the vibrant city, and murmured to himself, "For how much longer?" After being allowed into the city, Maxime and his mercenaries separated from the crowd on the central alley and moved into a cobbled alley, looking for a place to rest. The group, exhausted by the battles and the night's flight, was in desperate need of sleep. Rodrigo suddenly raised his hand and pointed to a carved wooden sign depicting a sleeping dragon, called L'Auberge de l'Elantre du Dragon. They entered, and were greeted by a puff of warmth and a delicious smell of stew. All the mercenaries began to swallow thanks to the smell, mixed with the cries of distress from their stomachs. The innkeeper, a stocky man with gray hair and bright eyes, quickly sized them up. But despite their dirty, battle-scarred outfits, he didn't neglect them. The weapons they carried made it clear that they were not to be trifled with. On the contrary, he knew better than to offend powerful fighters whatever their appearance. "Good evening and welcome to the Auberge de l'Elantre du Dragon. What can I do for you?" he asked in a slightly husky voice. Maxime placed a few gold coins on the counter, a payment that more than covered their needs. "A good meal and beds for 30, please." The innkeeper nodded and handed them iron keys, indicating the staircase to the upper floors. "Your meal will be ready in 15 minutes, you can rest in your rooms. Your room numbers are indicated on the keys. A member of our staff will come and let you know when your meal is ready." Maxime was satisfied and let the mercenaries disperse with their keys. Some collapsed on the beds as soon as they were in their rooms, others took the time to remove their dusty boots and tend to their wounds. As for Maxime, he sat on the edge of his bed for a while, his mind still tense, mentally replaying the latest events. The image of the orc army advancing under the trembling light of their torches still haunted his thoughts. Especially that mysterious orc shaman, he really thought for a moment that they would have been forced to engage in combat with those orcs. If that had happened, even he didn't know if he would have made it out alive. Shortly afterwards, a woman passed through the rooms to warn that the meal was ready. Some of the mercenaries had already fallen asleep, but they were shaken by their teammate to force them to go and eat. "Continue your adventure with my virtual library empire." At dawn, after a few hours' restful sleep and a hearty breakfast, Maxime gathered his men in the inn's great hall. They had all had a chance to take a bath in the water, while their equipment had been washed by the inn staff. They were much more presentable than when they had returned to town. Now they had to appear before Count Arden with proof of their battle and claim their reward. Each mercenary's features were marked by fatigue, but a gleam of determination shone in their eyes. Proudly carrying the saddlebag containing the orc ears, the group once again made their way through the streets of Lappi, which was slowly waking up under the first rays of the sun. Their passage through the streets frightened some of the town's citizens, as the aura they exuded in the street was still marked by the previous battles they had experienced. Unlike the civilians who circulated here and lived a happy, peaceful life, the mercenaries had seen blood, killed with their own hands, and put their lives on the line in recent days. So obviously, there was something of a collision between the two worlds when they came face to face. As they walked towards Count Arden's mansion, a group of young men in burgundy uniforms crossed by gold embroidery blocked their path. Leading the way was a young man named Leo, a tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed man who stopped them with suspicious eyes. "Well, what do you hope to achieve by parading around like that?" challenged Leo. Maxime, aware of the futility of a conflict here, replied calmly. "We're mercenaries. We're on our way to the manor to show the Count our military merits and claim our reward." The young teenagers were surprised, but when they saw that the mercenaries were mostly around their own age, they burst out laughing. Another apprentice, Tomas, a dark-haired, square-jawed boy, raised an eyebrow.
"Are you making fun of us?
"How could poor mercenaries like you kill orcs? Even apprentice knights like us have to risk our lives to kill just one." Maxime took another look at them. Lappy deserved to be a count's capital. They could meet a dozen apprentice knights at random in the morning. However, he was far too busy to waste time with apprentice knights who were obviously still in training and had therefore never seen blood. "Andrew, could you please clear the way?" The latter agreed with a big smile at Maxime's request. "It's my pleasure to do it." Seeing a red-haired young man emerge from the mercenary group, the apprentice knights felt contemptuous. "What do you plan to do?" asked Leo, curious. "Clear the way, of course. What else could I do?" The apprentice knights were particularly angry on hearing this, especially Tomas. "We're apprentice knights from the Purple Knight Academy. Our academy trains over 50 powerful apprentice knights every year. Do you really think a mere mercenary like you can defeat us?" In this world, apprentice knights almost never joined mercenary groups, as the risk-reward ratio was far more attractive when they served nobles than when they risked their lives as mercenaries. What's more, the profession of apprentice knight in the service of a nobleman was far more glorious than that of apprentice knight in a mercenary group. In fact, apprentice knights joining mercenaries were seen as waste products with no potential and a rebellious streak. As a result, Altia and Henry found it even more difficult to make a choice beforehand. "Oh, our apprentice knights from an academy so powerful!" exclaimed Andrew with a contemptuous smile.
Of course they are.
"Our breathing method and our training are far more qualitative than all the apprentice knights you could find at barons and viscounts," replied Leo confidently. "Exactly, we're one level above," continued Tomas. "During the tournaments held in the capital, we regularly manage to have an apprentice knight in the top 10. Our apprentice knights from the south are well known for their fighting power." Andrew felt like laughing to hear these guys boasting so much about their performance. Then suddenly he had a good idea. "In our mercenary group, we have 2 apprentice knights who come from Baron Irit's territory. Would you like to have a match?" "Apprentice knights in your mercenary group? And they want to compare themselves to us? Is this a joke? Who's even Baron Irit? Do you know the guys?"
"No, never heard of them."
The apprentice knights of the Purple Knight Academy burst out laughing. "Do you accept or not?" Andrew's firm, powerful voice calmed the apprentice knight's ardor. At this point, somehow, they sensed that Andrew was a particularly strong individual. "Yeah, we accept," finally replied Leo with a confident face. The ruckus began to draw many villagers into the street. Seeing that the situation could get out of hand, the apprentice knights proposed to have the duel at their academy. Andrew then looked to Maxime for authorization. Maxime gestured with his hand that he didn't care and could accept. "All right, we'll follow you." "Okay, we'll follow you." Quickly they headed out of the city center, as the academy was not located in town. So the group of mercenaries followed the apprentice knights through the cobbled streets of Lappy, making their way between market stalls and stone houses. The sound of their footsteps echoed, marking the approach of this unexpected duel. Curious locals watched them, murmuring among themselves. The mixture of students from the Purple Knight Academy dressed in luxurious clothes, and mercenaries dressed in pragmatic attire, was a stark contrast. It was a highly unusual scene in Lappy, and one that gave rise to many rumors. The Crimson Knights Academy was situated on a hill overlooking the city, silhouetted against the horizon with its imposing towers and large red and gold banners fluttering in the morning breeze. It was so well protected that it could literally serve as a fortress and outpost for Lappy. They passed through the heavy gates of the academy, where carefully tended gardens framed a vast cobbled courtyard. Lightly clad apprentice knights trained here, executing precise movements under the watchful gaze of their instructors. The sudden arrival of mercenaries accompanied by uniformed apprentices immediately drew attention. "What's going on here?" growled a massive white-haired man wearing shining armor adorned with silver roaring lion motifs. He was one of the academy's masters of arms, a respected veteran named Sir Alaric. Leo stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Master Alaric, we've decided to show these mercenaries the true power of an apprentice knight trained here at the Purple Knight Academy." Sir Alaric squinted, his attention focused on the mercenaries, whose posture was surprisingly relaxed, as if they'd come to sightsee. And who will challenge my apprentice knights? Andrew turned to Henry and beckoned him forward. Henry was perturbed. He'd heard all about this academy because it was so famous. He had once dreamed of joining this academy, but having been born in Baron Irit's territory, he was destined never to be able to join. I'm Henry, a former apprentice knight at Baron Irit's entrance stage. A murmur ran through the crowd that had formed around the courtyard. Sir Alaric nodded, intrigued.
So be it.
I want to see what you can do. Let the duel take place before everyone's eyes. A circle quickly formed, clearing a space in the center of the courtyard. Tomas, go ahead, you're at the entrance stage too, declared Leo calmly. Tomas nodded and positioned himself opposite Henry. But Henry had a hunch that he was much stronger than Thomas. So he made an unusual request.
Leo, you can come too.
The crowd let out a cry of surprise. Does he really want to do a 1 versus 2? The guy's totally oblivious. Leo is one of the top 10 best apprentice knights in 3RD year, while Thomas is one of the top 30 best apprentice knights in 3RD year 2. Especially as Leo is at the stage of small success. Between them, they could even beat the top 104th year apprentice knights. Henry calmly drew his sword, an ordinary sword that had already seen many battles, to show he was serious. Leo, accept. The firm voice of the Alaric instruction echoed on the spot. So annoying, murmured Leo, stepping forward in spite of himself. In no life would he dare answer the knight Alaric, who was among the most powerful knights in the south. Some said he was at least in the top 10 of the most powerful knights in the kingdom. After all, he'd have nothing to gain from such a duel, and if he lost, he'd lose face in front of a lot of people. But the battle was going to take place, whether he liked it or not. Tomas used a one-handed sword and shield, while Leo used a pair of daggers. Everyone was using real weapons, and with their physique, even if they were badly wounded, everyone could recover quickly. There was a tense silence, the air charged with adrenaline. Then Sir Alaric gave the signal. The two apprentices charged without delay, Tomas using his shield to try to destabilize Henry. But Henry deftly dodged, pivoting with feline precision. His blade whistled and struck the edge of the shield, sending the wearer reeling backwards. Leo tried to take advantage of the opening to thrust his dagger in, but Henry anticipated the move. He parried the attack and landed a swift kick, sending his opponent crashing to the ground. The mercenaries weren't particularly surprised, as these gestures were regularly practiced by Henry during training sessions. The crowd, however, was not at all accustomed to such gestures and was therefore stunned to see such a scene. Tomas, still standing, took a hesitant step backwards. Henry stepped forward with a piercing stare. Come on, show me what the Purple Academy has to offer. Sir Alaric's gaze, impassive but alert, followed Henry's every move, as he now stood alone against his two adversaries. This apprentice knight is doing really well, I wonder if he'd like to join our academy. Our academy really needs an apprentice knight with a powerful fighting instinct and excellent technical skills. Alaric's face remained impassive, but no one could have imagined that a powerful knight like him would covet a mercenary in the famous Purple Knight Academy. On the field, the silence was such that you could hear the wind slide over the banners. Leo, furious and humiliated by his fall, straightened up with feline grace, his daggers reflecting the morning light. Impressive, I admit, growled Leo, clenching his teeth in shame and anger. In his mind, mercenaries were nothing but vulgar cannon fodder. He'd never imagined he'd be taken down by one of them one day. But it's only just begun. Henry, his face relaxed but his muscles tense, repositioned himself, staring at his opponents. His gaze betrayed absolute concentration. The sword, though worn, was held with a mastery that escaped even the most incredulous onlookers. Tomas, slightly sweating, took a deep breath before glancing at Leo.
They exchanged a brief nod.
Sir Alaric squinted curiously. He was familiar with the silent language of apprentices preparing to attack together. In their academy, teamwork was very important and surpassed, in terms of importance, individual combat notes. Let's see how he handles this, he murmured to himself. Leo threw himself in first, his daggers glinting with a sharp gleam. He pounced like a feline, his movements swift and unpredictable, aiming at Henry's left flank. Simultaneously, Tomas took advantage of the opening to strike with his sword towards Henry's right shoulder. The duo hoped to throw Henry off balance with this coordinated attack. Experience new stories on my virtual library empire. But Henry, far from being caught off guard, pivoted on his heels with startling fluidity, forcing Leo to strike into the void. He raised his sword to parry Tomas's blow, the metallic shock resonating throughout the courtyard. In the same second, he stepped aside, pushing Tomas against Leo in a clumsy tangle. The stunned onlookers widened their eyes.
Murmurs grew louder.
How does he anticipate their movements? Wondered a young man in his first year. Another, more experienced, replied in a dull voice. It's not just his strength, it's his instinct. Not everyone was an apprentice knight at this academy. Generally speaking, they arrived at the academy with an ordinary physique. Those with excellent talent could reach the apprentice knight stage in the 2nd year, while most reached it in the 3rd. Leo, beside himself, charged again, his movements more aggressive, less considered. He feinted to the left, then charged at Henry from the right, his dagger searching for the slightest opening. Henry swung slightly with his right leg, narrowly dodging a blade, then used the pommel of his sword to strike Leo on the wrist. The dagger in his right hand fell, bouncing off the cobblestones with a clear clink. Taking advantage of the confusion, Tomas attempted a backhand attack, but Henry, as if with eyes in the back of his head, sensed the movement and turned. His blade met Tomas's in a controlled clash. He disarmed Tomas with a swift movement, the latter's sword whirling through the air before falling back to his feet. Tomas's defeated gaze met Henry's. Leo, now with only his dagger, took a few steps back, panting. A bitter smile contorted his features. It looks like we underestimated these mercenaries. Henry, without arrogance, lowered his sword, the point almost touching the ground. Strength comes not only from where you train, but from what you live. Strength comes not only from where you train, but from what you live. A heavy silence followed his words, then he raised a hand to signify the end of the duel. This is the end of the duel. I declare Henry the winner. Murmurs began to run through the crowd, having difficulty accepting the fact that a mercenary could defeat apprentice knights in their 3rd year at the academy. Everyone began to look at the mercenaries who had accompanied Henry. Henry must be a special existence among them, no? I hope so, because otherwise it would be really scary. Can you imagine a group of mercenaries all with that level of power? No, that's impossible, and then what kind of personal strength would it take to keep order in a group of men where everyone has the strength of an apprentice knight? You'd have to be at least as strong as a formal knight, wouldn't you? A few glances landed on Maxime, who had a simple smile on his face at this point. No, impossible that he's a knight, he looks maximum 20 years old. In the whole kingdom, only a few exceptional geniuses manage to become knights at that age. Especially since he looks more like 18 than 20. To become a knight at 18, in the entire history of the kingdom, there have been less than 5 people who have managed that feat, including the founding king. Sir Alaric's gaze met Henry's and he nodded slightly, a rare gesture from a man renowned for his rigor. The mercenaries, smiling at Henry, watched their comrade return to their ranks. Rodrigo patted Henry on the shoulder with a laugh. Well done, you've made your mark today. Henry sketched a calm smile. I just hope people stop underestimating our mercenaries. And especially by improving our group's reputation, we'll also be able to earn more money. The mercenaries nearby all heard Henry's words and most began to laugh loudly, drawing curious glances from the students of the Purple Knight Academy. You've got it, Henry, commented Rodrigo, laughing. But their laughter gradually stopped as Sir Alaric stepped forward, his imposing stature dominating the courtyard. All the mercenaries were aware that this man could crush them all single-handed, if it weren't for Maxime. And even with Maxime, it would be a tragic fight without his talent. A silence fell, and every apprentice knight, every mercenary, held his breath. Henry, he began, his voice deep. Rare are those who have been able to face 2 of our students alone and win hands down with a kingdom similar to theirs or even inferior. His stern gaze was tinged with admiration. You've proved that your training, though different, has nothing to envy that of our students. A murmur of approval went through the crowd. Leo, still panting with frustration on his face, stared at Henry with a mixture of respect and bitterness. Tomas, for his part, acknowledged his defeat without rancor. From his point of view, they had been completely dominated from start to finish. Naturally, such an adversary deserved his respect. Sir Alaric continued, turning to the school students, who were turning out in ever-increasing numbers in the wake of the event. Among them were even 4th and 5th graders. There were no 6th graders, which was also the last year, as 6th graders gained experience fighting orcs. Let this be a lesson to all. True strength is not limited to the fighting techniques acquired within these walls, but to the experience and instinct gained in battle. The Master-at-Arms spoke again, this time addressing Henry directly. I see in you a potential that exceeds what I've seen in many of my students. In this exceptional case, I invite you to join the Academy of the Purple Knights. Your next read is at my virtual library empire. Your talents, if cultivated here, could make you a powerful knight. A shocked silence fell over the crowd. Some of the apprentice knights looked at each other in disbelief. Henry, caught off guard by this unexpected offer, remained calm. The idea of joining an academy with such prestige, which is the dream of so many, had often haunted him when he was still in training at Hippocamp. But he turned to his fellow mercenaries, meeting Maxime's still calm gaze. Then he turned back to Chevalier Alaric, with a confident smile. "Master Alaric, this is an honor I would never have dared hope for," Henry replied, his clear voice finally breaking the silence. Sir Alaric was beginning to put on a slight smile, but the words that followed made his face change completely. "Master Alaric, this is an honor I would never have dared hope for.
But I cannot accept.
My path has been paved by my fellow mercenaries. They trained me, supported me, and became my family. My destiny is with them." A stunned silence fell over the courtyard. The apprentices exchanged shocked glances, and even Sir Alaric, master of his emotions, let slip a flash of surprise mixed with a little anger at being rejected in front of so many people. Leo, watching Henry, had a look filled with respect and frustration, understanding at that moment that the man they had faced was not only physically strong, but mentally too. "Are you sure of your decision? A group of mercenaries will only waste your talents in addition to drastically increasing your chances of dying without a burial ground." Sir Alaric's words didn't make the mercenaries laugh at all. And having been through several battles in a short space of time, everyone was hot-blooded now. Everyone laid hands on their weapons, ready to draw at the slightest command from Maxime. This immediately changed the mood of the place. The apprentice knights, especially the 4th and 5th graders, had previously been completely uninterested and even scornful of Henry. From their point of view, he had only benefited from a little surprise. A mere apprentice knight at the entry stage didn't deserve praise in front of them, most of whom had reached the stage of minor or even major success. They were all highly skilled fighters. But at this moment, they were all intimidated by the momentum of the saber-toothed tigers. 20 of them in particular, while another 10 didn't seem to know how to react. Maxime stepped forward to face Sir Alaric, before the shocked eyes of the crowd. He silently activated his talent, suddenly giving off a powerful burst of energy. He controlled his talent as best he could so that it was active only on himself. After all, he had already activated his talent less than 24 hours earlier. But he hadn't used up all his energy when he activated it, so he still had enough energy left to activate it again, limiting the effect on himself for a few minutes. His eyes and hair changing color shocked everyone. No one had ever seen anything so magical. "Chevalier Alaric, is it? You can secretly despise us, but you can't publicly humiliate our mercenary group. Chevalier Alaric, is it? You can secretly despise us, but you can't publicly humiliate our mercenary group." The experienced mercenaries dispersed in an arc behind Maxime, tending to surround Alaric. The rookies stayed behind, watching in amazement, including Garin, Lyra, and Jean. They'd seen them take on orcs and win easily. But to face a knight, and worse still, a powerful and well-known knight like Alaric, was something they would never have imagined even in their wildest dreams. But Maxime was mad, and his men were starting to go mad too at the slightest unpleasant thought. Chevalier Alaric was surprised to see such momentum generated by a simple group of mercenaries. He'd seen individuals form such a surge before, even the Count had his own elite troop that could do it. But this was a Count's elite troop. A troop that brought together the most talented individuals in a Count's territory, who had been trained by methods proven and perfected from generation to generation over hundreds of years, and whose investment in gold coins was colossal. And now, in front of him, a group of mercenaries with no reputation could do the same.
What a surprise.
Not wishing to provoke unnecessary conflict, and with the fault all his own, Alaric apologized. "I underestimated you, and I apologize." He bowed slightly, then looked at Maxime with strange eyes. Clearly, this young man was gifted with a monstrous talent. Suddenly, the crowd began to shout, taking Sir Alaric's attention away from Maxime. While the crowd was still stirring, a lone figure appeared in the distance and walked calmly towards where everyone had gathered. A crimson cape, richly embroidered with gold thread, billowed lightly behind him. Count Arden, director of the Academy of Purple Knights, was arriving. He wore a deep purple coat with intricate embroidery of silver lions. Beneath the coat, a black leather tunic reinforced with polished metal plates completed his martial stature. His dark leather boots pounded the ground, and every step he took seemed to increase his momentum. His piercing, almost icy gaze swept the scene with an acuity that laid bare the very essence of each person. The murmurings ceased instantly when his eyes met Maxime's. The latter, still under the spell of his own presence, was in awe. The latter, still in the grip of his talent, felt the tension rise a notch. Count Arden, though alone, exuded an overwhelming aura, like a king without a crown. Continue reading on my virtual library empire. With a slow gesture, Arden raised his hand. Good morning, dear students, good morning, Alaric, and good morning, saber-toothed tigers. When he spoke the name of their mercenary group, Maxime was perturbed. It would seem that the Count had an extensive intelligence network. The students were equally surprised, beginning to wonder if these mercenaries were known. At the very least, they must have done something that deserved to be brought to the Count's attention. Alaric bowed slightly in the Count's direction. Director, these men have shown a strength that even our best students at the same stage cannot match. The Count was not surprised, obviously already having information. Yes, it's not surprising. Of the 30 mercenaries you have before you, 20 of them have already defeated orcs in 1 versus 1, while the remaining 10 are new recruits. Count Arden's words shocked the crowd. Then, turning to the crowd and the still stunned students, he added, "Let this be a lesson to you all. There's a world behind the walls of this academy, and it's far more vast and mysterious than you can imagine." All the students nodded firmly. With that answer, the principal turned back to the mercenaries. "Just know that if you have knightly talent, the academy will always have its doors open, should you ever feel the urge to follow another path." Seeing no danger, Maxime deactivated his talent. "Thank you, Monsieur le Comte, it's an honor to be recognized by you." "No worries," replied the Count, simply nodding. "I don't suppose you've come to Lappy to take on my students?" he added in a calm tone. "Indeed, we've come both to offer our services to Count Arden and at the same time to claim military merit. So, Maxime, you can follow me to my office at the academy to discuss the matter. As for your men, you can let them train here with our students. In exchange, they can eat in the academy dining room. The best chefs in the territory work here with the most nutritious products we can find." The mercenaries exchanged satisfied and curious glances at the idea of training with the academy students while enjoying sumptuous meals afterwards. Rodrigo, a mischievous smile at the corner of his lips, whispered to Ernest, "Hey, I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of fun. Be gentle with them, they've never seen blood." "Of course, who do you think I am?" Andrew and Laura didn't seem particularly interested. Andrew only liked fights where he put his life or future on the line, while Laura didn't see the point in fighting students who'd never had a setback in life. Charles seemed slightly excited, wanting to measure himself against the academy's greatest geniuses if possible and see what level of strength he could muster. Garen's gaze was fixed on the academy's students, as if he could see his future. Lyra, at his side, added in a low voice, "Do you think we'll be able to fight too? We're still too weak now, but I'm sure that in the near future, not only will we be able to fight them, we'll win." Jean arrived at their side, having heard their words. "Good mentality, we'll grow stronger together." Garen and Lyra smiled in response, full of confidence. After all, with the support of their leader's monstrous talent, they could only grow stronger. As Maxime followed the Count, the mercenaries dispersed to the training area under the watchful, intrigued eyes of the academy students. Sir Alaric took his place as observer, ready to oversee this unexpected encounter between the mercenaries and his students. He was curious to see how these fighters from such different backgrounds would interact and confront each other. A young fourth grader stepped forward, his brown hair tied back in a tight ponytail, his expression stern.
"My name is Alden.
Who would like a friendly duel?" Rodrigo stepped forward and replied with a welcoming, confident smile.
I accept. It's going to be fun."
Other students ranging from first graders to fifth graders began to initiate various duels with the mercenaries. Eventually, even the new mercenaries were warmly welcomed by the apprentice knights. Of course, the apprentice knights knew that they were just villagers a few days ago and simply began to teach them a few basics. Meanwhile, Maxime followed Count Arden through the academy's imposing corridors. Behind them, the sound of the first clashes of swords was already resounding, marking the beginning of this encounter that would definitively redefine the image of the saber-toothed tigers. The corridor that Maxime walked alongside Count Arden was lined with tapestries depicting the exploits of the Academy's most renowned knights. "Curious about these knights?" asked the Count, his voice echoing down the corridor. "Rather, yes. At what points are they strong to have their portrait hung here?" Maxime was genuinely curious. This world has its own history, and each story has its own singularity that makes it interesting. Most of them are as strong as me, if not stronger than me.
So powerful?
These are people who have reached at least the stage of Grand Knight. The Count nodded as he walked on. Correct, with the exception of a few people who were on the borderline of the Knight stage and who performed particularly important meritorious deeds. Otherwise, I've heard rumors about you, Maxime. The Count is joking. What kind of rumors can circulate about a mercenary without renown? Yet I have heard rumors about a very powerful young man who grows stronger and stronger, possessing a strength that could explode at any moment. He also has under his command ordinary former villagers who in a very short time have become as strong as apprentice knights. After the Count mentioned the name of the mercenary group, Maxime already expected the Count to have a lot of information on them. But he was still surprised to learn that the Count knew so much about him. These rumors are exaggerated, one doesn't become stronger overnight, but it must be said that I have a certain eye for spotting people with potential. Maxime preferred to play the modesty card mixed with a little truth, rather than say directly, I have a monstrous talent that means anyone can become as much as an elite soldier in a very short time or even an apprentice knight for those if the original talent is better than average. The Count stopped abruptly and turned his head towards him, his gaze piercing. Your men have potential, that's undeniable. But what interests me is you, and what you're really after by coming here.
Gold? Glory?
Or something deeper? Maxime hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice lowered, almost meditative. What I'm looking for goes beyond gold or glory. I want to offer my men and those who follow us the chance to choose their own path, far from the inflexible laws of lords and knights. I want to show that we can become a force in our own right, without having to bend the knee a nobleman. Obviously this was all bullshit. What in this world was more important than gold to Maxime? A slight smile appeared on the Count's lips, revealing a mixture of approval and intrigue. You remind me of someone, Maxime. Someone who once wanted to change the world without submitting to the rules that already existed. He resumed his walk, and Maxime followed him in silence, pondering the meaning of these words. What was this man's name? Count Arden didn't answer immediately, as if pondering whether he should answer this question. His name was Igor, he finally replied in a flat tone. Maxime made a note in his head to research the subject later, as Count Arden obviously didn't want to talk about it in depth. A few moments later, they finally reached the Count's office. It was a room of impressive dimensions, with bookcases covered with rare manuscripts and detailed maps of the kingdom. A large window overlooked the training yard, where duels between mercenaries and apprentices were beginning to intensify. Arden walked over to a table in the center of the room and placed a sealed parchment on it. Before we talk about military merits or anything else, there's something I wish to show you, Maxime. He tore off the seal and unrolled the parchment on a large table in the middle of the room. Maxime's eyes crinkled as he read the words written on it. It was a report detailing the appearance of new troop movements on the kingdom's frontier, particularly the troops of Count Arden, Baron Raulf, Viscountess Elda, and other nobles. There was also mention of the movements of various orc armies, including the one Maximus had encountered before arriving in Lappy. You understand why I'm showing you this, don't you? Asked Arden with an intriguing smile. But Maxime shook his head. How could I guess the Count's thoughts? Could you enlighten me? The Count placed his hands on the table and leaned towards Maxime. Stay updated via my virtual library empire. It's no accident that I agreed to receive you so promptly. Your group and your talent could play a key role in the war against the orcs. Maxime looked up as he met the Count's intense gaze. Yes, and that's what I intended to do with my mercenary group. The Count nodded slowly. Of balance in this storm. The silence that followed was heavy, while outside, the sound of clashing blades continued and could be faintly heard in the room. I hope you're joking, Maxime finally added with displeasure. Among the orc armies there are many orcs comparable to knights. To send us against them is to send us to die. The Count continued to smile, clearly not worried that Maxime would refuse. I'm not asking you and your mercenaries to go against these armies. On the contrary, I'd like you to do the things you already know how to do. Maxime frowned, confused. Meaning? Save the villages. The Count replied directly. Then he went on to explain. Orc armies, for greater efficiency, dispatch their armies quickly to eradicate as many villages as possible in a short time, while plundering as much food as possible. For us, this increases the difficulty of the task enormously, as our manpower is limited and not flexible enough. So we're in urgent need of help right now. And for that I'm prepared to pay a high price. Maxime finally understood the Count's intentions, and it was indeed up to them. How much would the salary be? 300 gold pieces, adding a bonus of 1 gold piece per orc killed, while an orc with the strength of a knight will count for 100 gold pieces. Maxime was about to negotiate the price, seeming slightly too low in his opinion, but before he could, the Count added a short sentence. Oh, and it's 300 gold pieces a week, not a month. Maxime was shocked but contained his surprise inside himself. A Count's wealth is indeed beyond my imagination, Maxime thought silently. Thanks to the Count, Maxime will be able to earn at least 1,200 gold coins, a huge fortune at his stage. With such a sum coming his way, Maxime couldn't help but have an exciting thought. Maybe I'll have enough to improve my talent? Nox limit level 1, rank unknown, 0/1000. Let's try to save as much as we can this month. I wonder what might happen once the talent is improved. Maxime had a vague intuition that upgrading didn't improve existing effects, but rather that it would unlock a new effect. But for the moment that didn't matter. That's a generous offer, Monsieur le Comte, but I have one condition.
Tell me, Maxime.
I wish to retain full power over our movements, meaning that you can issue missions and we are free to accept them or not. At the same time, in the field, I remain the person who gets the final say on the fate of my men. The Count hesitated only a moment before nodding. From the outset, he had no intention of controlling the movements of Maxime and his mercenaries. On the contrary, he was spending a little money to get a surprise.
Yes, a surprise.
He was making a bet here. If it succeeded, so much the better. If not, he'd only be a little disappointed. I hear your request, Maxime, and I accept it. You'll have carte blanche to conduct your operations as you see fit, provided you deliver regular reports on your missions. And believe me, these reports will be closely scrutinized. Maxime nodded, satisfied with this clause. We have a deal then, he replied, extending his hand towards Arden. We have an agreement then, he replied, extending his hand towards Arden. The Count shook hands with Maxime, formalizing the alliance.
Excellent.
I'll have provisions and detailed maps of the most endangered areas prepared. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention it, but you can let your men live and eat here. I think that would be both beneficial to the apprentice knights at the academy and to your mercenaries, especially your new recruits. Maxime was happy to hear this news. He was going to save gold on food and lodging, so how could he not be? But this happiness was quickly disrupted. A crash resounded from the courtyard, drawing their attention. The duels between mercenaries and students had taken on a new intensity. Through the window, they could see Andrew, sword in hand, in battle with Alden, one of the best fifth-year students at the Purple Knight Academy. The two adversaries were exchanging rapid blows, their movements exuding a fluidity and precision that drew the attention of all onlookers. Arden, an enigmatic smile on his lips, observed the scene. This student is named Alden. He is the son and principal heir of Baron Raoulf. Maxime looked at Arden, waiting for him to elaborate. He's an apprentice knight at the stage of great success and he's really not far from the peak stage. Your mercenary will probably be defeated. But Maxime shook his head. Andrew is one of the strongest mercenaries under my command, and more importantly he's one of the few mercenaries who have been with me from the beginning. I think he has a chance. The Count was surprised, even he found it hard to believe that, apart from Maxime, his men could achieve such a high level of strength. Reading reports was one thing, seeing it with his own eyes was quite another. I find it hard to believe, Alden has his own method of breathing and he's been training longer than the other students here. What's more, he's naturally gifted with a talent for swordsmanship, making him a true genius. Maxime smiles in response, the facts will speak for him. See for yourself. On the ground, blows followed one another with almost supernatural speed, the sound of metal echoing through the air like a violent melody. Andrew's every move seemed wild and incoherent, but he himself knew that he absolutely calculated every gesture he made. In the absence of training methods, all mercenaries became like this, developing their own style of mastery according to the weapons they wielded. Maxime's talent enabled them to do such a thing, which normally could only be done by geniuses. However, Alden, with his experience and rigorous training, seemed to anticipate every attack, countering with disconcerting ease. Murmurs intensified among the spectators who had gathered around the courtyard. Some were betting on the noble prodigy, Alden, while others, fascinated by the strength of the mercenaries, were hoping Andrew would stand up to one of the academy's top students. Andrew, muscles taut and eyes focused, managed to get dangerously close to Alden with an unexpected sequence of moves. A series of subtle feints led Alden to step back for the first time since the beginning of the duel. A murmur of astonishment ran through the crowd. Maxime felt a surge of pride mixed with a hint of apprehension. Andrew was good, but the longer the duel went on, the more he saw what a formidable opponent Alden was. In a duel, anything can happen very quickly. As if to respond to his opponent's audacity, Alden abruptly changed his rhythm. He pivoted to the side, exploiting an unexpected angle to deliver a swift blow that grazed Andrew's shoulder. The latter barely dodged, the sweat beading on his forehead and the tension in the air becoming palpable. Maxime squinted, analyzing every movement, every detail of Andrew's posture from the window of the Count's office. He knew that even the slightest mistake would be enough to tip the balance. It was then that Andrew, taking a deep breath, adopted a different approach as they exchanged blows. Rather than attacking head-on, he opted for a defensive posture, a thin smile appearing on his lips. Alden, surprised by this change, hesitated for a fraction of a second to change his style and become aggressive, and that was all Andrew needed. He immediately went back on the offensive, surprising his opponent with this chaotic sword style. First, he swung his sword as a feint, putting only 1 point of strength into the strike. Enjoy more content from my virtual library empire. By the time Alden received the blow and saw the lack of power, it was already too late. Andrew immediately bent down and delivered a powerful sweep to Alden. Alden fell immediately. When he opened his eyes, he saw a red-haired young man pointing a sword at his throat. A muffled silence fell over the courtyard, followed by loud applause. Sir Alaric approached Andrew, took his left arm and raised it. I declare Andrew, mercenary with the saber-toothed tigers, winner of this duel. Impressive, murmured Arden, his eyes showing surprise but also satisfaction. Maxime smiled discreetly. This duel was important because it had cemented the fact that his mercenaries could stand on an equal footing with the apprentice knights of the academy. Then the sound of applause began to fade, giving way to animated conversation between the spectators. Alden, for his part, rose to his feet with dignity, despite his defeat, and extended his hand to Andrew. A gesture which, for all present, symbolized more than a simple duel. It was a sign of recognition, a tacit acceptance of his opponent's strength. Andrew, slightly out of breath, took Alden's hand and helped him to his feet, provoking new murmurs from the crowd. The exchange of glances between the two young men was marked by mutual respect, a respect that was not given, but deserved. Arden turned back to Maxime. You must know that this victory will change many things here. Many students at the academy will not tolerate being weaker than mercenaries.
Maxime nodded.
That's good news then, they'll put more effort and sweat into their training, and less blood will flow on the battlefield. The Count smiled, amused by the young mercenary leader's audacity. A messenger rushed into the office just then, breaking off their conversation. The young man, out of breath, carried a parchment with burnt edges, obviously brought in urgently. Your lordship, a report from the scouts. Orc troops have been spotted a day's march from the village of Irina. Arden grasped the parchment with a firm hand, his features hardening as he heard the words. He quickly read the report in less than 2 minutes, then looked up at Maxime, a determined glint in his eye.
Prepare your men.
If you accept, your first mission will begin tomorrow. Get your men ready. If you accept, your first mission will begin tomorrow. Do we have any details on the number of orcs we'll be facing? Count Arden looked at Maxime approvingly. A leader shouldn't rush headlong into a mission without knowing the details of his opponent. There are only about 30 orcs, but all of them are rather large and therefore strong. Maxime didn't know this information, as studying orcs is part of the courses received at university. No one expects students in high school to fight orcs, and teaching them to fight them will only encourage students to fight them, and in most cases, to die quickly.
What does that mean?
What exactly should I expect? Count Arden was slightly surprised that Maxime didn't know this kind of common sense. Then he remembered that he was young and not noble, so it was rather understandable. We consider that as soon as an orc exceeds 2 meters, which is the case for most orcs, they have the strength to take on an apprentice knight. If an orc exceeds 3 meters, he can barely take on a knight, but he'll probably end up losing, and in short order. This knight will undoubtedly win thanks to his agility and technique. Because a contest of strength with an orc is generally a bad idea. Maxime reflected slightly, and guessed that, based on the system, 1 meter of height was equal to 1 point of physique. However, unlike the physique of humans, which was generally very balanced, that of orcs leaned heavily towards strength, endurance and defense, to the detriment of agility. Hence the Count's remarks. And according to the information, there are orcs to pay attention to? Yes, they're led by an orc measuring 3 meters tall, and there are also 5 orcs measuring between 2.5 meters and 2.7 meters tall. The rest are pretty ordinary, ranging from 2 meters to 2.3 meters. Maxime nodded, quickly analyzing the situation. The orc measuring over 3 meters had to represent the greatest challenge, especially if he had the ability to command and coordinate the other orcs. The mention of the 5 intermediate-sized orcs between 2.5 and 2.7 meters indicated powerful orcs that could seriously injure or even kill some of the mercenaries if they weren't careful. It's feasible, but we need to prepare our strategy well, Maxime thought silently. Count Arden watched him with rapt attention. Maxime's thoughtful reaction, his ability to envisage solutions and not just reactions, confirmed that he was not dealing with a simple mercenary leader. I wonder if he's born with it, or has someone taught him? Thought Count Arden silently. The Count could never have imagined that Maxime came from another world, and that in this world there were many subjects to study in connection with the world of eternity. We accept this mission. Arden inclined his head, satisfied with the swift, assured response. Irina is a strategic position, and its loss would weaken our control over the entire southern region. The defense of the village is crucial, but it might just be a prelude to something bigger. Maxime frowned slightly, catching the nuance in the Count's words. You think the orcs are planning a major incursion? Arden nodded slowly, his gaze lost for a moment in memories of ancient battles.
It's highly probable.
There are rumors of a coalition between orc tribes, a rare and worrying event. If they're true, we can expect a more devastating wave than usual.
Maximus frowned.
The Count's words are the same as Baron Edrin's, so there really could be something dark afoot. Maxime and the Count then discussed a few innocuous things, before Maxime respectfully left the Count's office. After leaving the office, Maxime joined the courtyard, where Andrew was still chatting with Alden and other apprentice knights, while the other mercenaries were busy learning duels with the other apprentice knights. There were victories and defeats on both sides, but the main thing was that each side learned from the other. The mercenaries learned the orderly, methodical style of the apprentice knights, while the apprentice knights learned to counter the unpredictable and particularly deadly styles of the mercenaries. But the arrival of Maxime caught everyone's attention, bringing the duels to a temporary halt. Get ready, saber-toothed tigers. We leave at dawn to defend Irina's village. The mercenaries exchanged glances, smiles taut with concentrated faces.
Andrew, who was closest, nodded. Agreed, Chief. We'll be ready.
Alden, sensing an excellent opportunity to make progress, interrupted Maxime. I wish to accompany you. A murmur of astonishment ran through the ranks, as Maxime watched the young knight with a piercing gaze. But for him, having an apprentice knight at the stage of great additional success was an important added strength.
So get ready, Alden.
At sunrise, we'll leave to face this storm together. There's still time before you leave, why don't you train with me in the meantime? Maxime turned to the person who had said this with surprise. Chevalier Alaric. Why are you afraid? Added Alaric with a teasing smile. No, but the difference in strength is far too great between us. Explore more at my virtual library empire. Alaric shook his head with amusement. Don't worry, I'm simply offering you a personal course to improve your skills. All the apprentice knights in the academy couldn't believe it, and displayed gaping mouths. One apprentice knight murmured. Am I dreaming, or did I really hear what I heard? I think I heard the same thing, added another nearby. Professor Alaric really did offer personal training to the mercenary leader. Luck. Normally you have to be top in the top 3 of your year to benefit from it, and even then it's only a few hours guidance. The crowd was a little disgruntled and jealous of such preferential treatment for an outsider to the academy. Sir Alaric noticed this, and laughed at the apprentice knights. If you can reach the level of a knight at his age, even if he's the weakest knight who ever existed, then I'll gladly teach you all day. The apprentice knights were shocked, while the mercenaries were suspicious that this knight could directly guess their leader's level of strength. Don't deny it, Maxime, when you gave off that aura earlier, I felt threatened. Now you're back to normal, but you must still have the level of a knight. Maxime shook his head. I'm at most slightly stronger than the apprentice knights at the peak stage, but the power of a knight is still a long way off. Maxime's words created a silence in the crowd. A mercenary from nowhere could take down all the students of the strongest academy in the south of the kingdom.
It was unheard of.
A mercenary from nowhere could take down all the students of the strongest academy in the south of the kingdom.
It was unheard of.
Even the 6th graders weren't that strong. If anything, the strongest of them had reached the peak stage, but he was still at the very beginning of that stage. Why do this for me? Maxime was wary. For him nothing in the world was free. The people who helped you always gained something in one way or another. It could be for their own morals, their image, or some other strange motive. For example, to satisfy a feeling of superiority, or to be able to tell people around them and take pride in it. At my age, I'll never be able to reach the level of a great knight. But if I can be the teacher, even if only one day, of a future great knight, then that would be the pride of my life. Alaric was the honest, straightforward type, so he explained his intentions and motivations directly. And who knows, maybe one day it'll be me who needs your help. Maxime understood better, and accepted the situation. His mastery of the sword still lagged behind his physique. Getting advice from an expert swordsman and teacher at a famous academy was an opportunity not to be missed. In that case, it would be my honor, Professor Alaric. The knight was pleased to be called so by Maxime. Let's go train further away so as not to disturb the students and mercenaries here. Of course, I'll follow you, Professor. After saying this, Maxime left to train in a corner of the academy, while the rest of the mercenaries and apprentice knights stood dumbfounded for a moment. Shortly afterwards, they resumed their training. Maxime and Chevalier Alaric approached a small training yard, an area reserved for advanced exercises, at the rear of the academy. Stay here a moment, I'll take off my armor or I'll end up sweating, Alaric said with a laugh.
No worries.
Meanwhile, Maxime looked around. This area, surrounded by stone walls adorned with ivy and punctuated by statues of legendary warriors, was usually reserved for teachers' personal training sessions. Maxime noticed that these statues were very similar to the paintings he had seen in the corridors leading to the principal's office. He noticed that there were precious wooden dummies marked with hundreds of sword strokes, various training weapons neatly arranged on racks, and a dirt floor impregnated with the imprints of past battles. Maxime waited patiently, warming up and practicing as usual. Alaric soon returned, dressed in very simple clothes. Seeing him like this, if you omitted the sword in his hand, you could almost mistake him for a simple farmer. Take this sword, said Alaric, pointing to a blunt steel training blade in the weapons rack. His own sword glinted softly in the torchlight. The man, despite his dappled gray hair, stood straight, sharp-eyed and alert. With my physique, I could seriously injure you without meaning to. Maxime reached for the sword, feeling its weight in his hand. The balance was perfect, a sign of the superior quality of the Academy's weapons. We'll start with some basic movements, Alaric explained. I want to see how you defend yourself and how you react to unexpected attacks. Silence fell again, broken only by the rustle of leaves and wind. With a fluid movement, Alaric attacked, his blade emitting a whistling sound as it split the air. Maxime blocked the attack with a quick reflex, the impact vibrating in his arm. The knight followed up with a series of swift, precise blows, each calculated to test his opponent's reflexes and defense. Maxime defended himself with total concentration, using movements he had learned as best he could through combat and self-reflection. He also applied Killian's advice on how to defend himself. Yet Alaric gave him no respite, constantly changing rhythm and angle of attack. After several intense minutes, the knight stopped, his face animated by a sincere smile.
Impressive.
You have sharp reflexes and unconventional technique. You seem to have been trained in ways I'm not familiar with. Maxime nodded, out of breath. Those short minutes had left him deeply exhausted. He had the feeling that if he lost concentration for even a moment, he'd end up in two pieces. Yet he knew that their swords were blunt. But this thought was more than real. He really felt that Alaric had the power to cut him cleanly in two. Experience tales at my virtual library empire.
But he was happy.
The recognition of a master like Alaric was priceless. Your skills are incredible, Professor. I can already see where I need to improve. Alaric gave a short, frank laugh. You don't think it's over, do you? Now we'll work on the counterattack. Get ready. Training resumed, even more intensely. Maxime had to learn not just to endure, but to seize every opening Alaric deliberately left. As the minutes passed, the bond between the two men grew stronger, a mutual respect forged in the exchange of blades and the sweat beading on their foreheads. As the training drew to a close, Maxime knelt briefly, exhausted. Alaric laid a hand on his shoulder. You've got potential, Maxime. Keep up this thirst for learning and you'll go far. Thank you, Professor. The day passed quickly. Twilight gradually enveloped the Purple Knight Academy, bathing the ancient stones and slender towers of the complex in amber hues. Built on a hill, the academy dominated the surrounding area, offering a breathtaking view of the forests and rolling plains. Its buildings, though simple in architecture, bore the hallmarks of subtle wealth, arches adorned with engravings recounting legendary battles, stained glass windows reflecting the soft glow of candlelight, and thick carpets in crimson and gold covering the floors of the great halls. Most of the saber-toothed tiger mercenaries, who had become accustomed to self-built wooden huts or simple tents, were impressed by the atmosphere of this fortress. Only a few seemed indifferent to such wealth. These were Rodrigo, Ernest, Laura, and Izo. The first two came from noble families, so this was understandable, although nobody knew exactly where they came from. All the other mercenaries knew was that they were considered trash in their families. Izo, who was one of the mercenaries who had joined Maxime at the very beginning, had always been an emotionless individual. As if the outside world couldn't affect him. Even when Quessois had been destroyed by bandits, he had shown no emotion. So the mercenaries were used to it, although everyone watched Izo from time to time to see if he could display anything other than an imperturbable face. Enjoy exclusive content from my virtual library empire. But that never happened. On the other hand, the mystery surrounding Laura was total. Her past was something dark, as everyone had guessed. But no one dared ask her what she'd been through. It was in this atmosphere that they continued walking, eventually arriving in a gigantic room, where 3 extremely long tables were placed, each able to seat over 100 people. The room was extremely well decorated, with paintings hanging on the walls, showing various war scenes that had been important in the history of Ravemont County. Many showed war scenes with orcs, while others showed scenes against other humans. Some even featured men riding griffins. At the back of the room was a table reserved for teachers if they wished to eat here and or announce something to the students. The mercenaries spread out with the apprentice knights with whom they had got to know. This created a very friendly and pleasant atmosphere. Servants in embroidered tunics moved silently about, bringing dishes garnished with roasted meats, seasoned vegetables and still warm bread. The tables in the large common room, made of dark polished wood, were illuminated by hanging candlesticks that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Stories, battle anecdotes and funny training moments were shared. Voices and laughter echoed around the room. Andrew, raising a glass of fruity-tasting wine, toasted a young knight who recounted how he had almost lost his life in the city. On patrol in the town center, he had noticed a fight between some elderly people. Not wanting to see anyone hurt in front of him, he tried to stop the fight. But when he approached them and decided to stop them with his powerful physique, he was sent straight to the ground. As it turned out, these old men were all retired apprentice knights who had seen many battlefields. Even if old age had caused them to lose a lot of strength, it was more than enough to deal with an inexperienced apprentice knight at the entry stage. When the anecdote was told, giggles were heard at their table. Others then began to recount similar experiences, which further amplified the laughter of those at the table. It seemed that these old men were notorious for fighting amongst themselves, and that many an apprentice knight had been beaten by them. And unfortunately for them, being valuable soldiers who had performed meritorious deeds, the Count turned a blind eye to all their actions as long as they weren't excessive. On the other side of the room, Alden was chatting with James and Pietro, his eyes sparkling with curiosity as he listened to their tales of battle against bandits and orcs. At another table, Terry and Lyra sat side by side, chatting with apprentice knights. No one noticed that their hands were intertwined under the table. Little by little, the warriors grew tired. The voices died away, giving way to the crackling fire of the torches illuminating the academy, and the light wind whistling through the ramparts. The mercenaries slept in the very comfortable beds of the 6th-year apprentice knights who were in training, and who wouldn't be back so soon. For their part, the apprentice knights returned to their own dormitories, the last words exchanged fading into the quiet night. At the first light of dawn, Maxime stood ready, his figure erect before the massive doors of the academy. His stern gaze swept over the gathering warriors. The saber-toothed tigers, armed and braced, took up their positions, closely followed by a few apprentice knights led by Alden. Each of them wanted to gain real combat experience before the 6th year. Clearly, the Count had great confidence in Maxime and let these apprentice knights accompany him. The sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, bathing the courtyard in a golden glow and casting elongated shadows on the academy walls. A solemn silence fell as Maxime raised a hand, drawing everyone's attention. His eyes met those of his mercenaries, battle-hardened faces, some bearing visible scars while others concealed deeper, invisible wounds. The new recruits remained in the academy for training. On this mission, they would only be a hindrance, given their physical appearance. So the mercenaries returned, 20 in number. The 5 young apprentice knights, including Alden, less experienced but just as determined, stood up straight, listening respectfully. There were 3 apprentice knights in the small success stage and 2 others, including Alden, in the large success stage. Saber-toothed tigers, apprentice knights, began Maxime, his strong, confident voice echoing through the academy's imposing doors. Today we leave for Irina's village. We will go together with a clear strategy, and above all with confidence in each other. Everyone here has a role to play. Our lives depend on everyone's cooperation and discipline. So whatever happens, remember, protect your allies, stand by each other and remain clear-headed in the decisions you make. Don't let the excitement of battle overwhelm you. Andrew raised his sword in a rallying gesture, shouting in a loud voice, "For Irina and for honor." The other tigers followed his example, their voices rising to seal their commitment. For Irina and for honor. For Irina and for honor. For Irina and for honor. The apprentice knights shouted back, feeling their spirits rise and their fears and anxieties fade slightly, replaced by fighting spirit, courage and positivism. Maxime and his men set off with this energy under the mysterious eyes of the Count and Chevalier Alaric, who had been observing the scene from the top of the ramparts. "I see your pensive director, don't you trust them?" asked Alaric calmly. No, it's not that, but I don't know why I have a bad feeling about it, replied the Count, frowning. No, it's not that, but I don't know why I have a bad feeling about it, replied the Count, frowning. On the way, Rodrigo walked alongside Ernest, chatting quietly in a low voice like most mercenaries. They were supposed to arrive in the evening, so it was bound to be hard not to get bored for so long.
These were men, not machines.
To make up for this, Maxime designated a few men each, 2 at the front, 2 at the back and 1 on each side, for a total of 6 men. They thus formed 4 teams, and the teams rotated every hour. These teams, when on duty, were not to talk and were to reserve all their attention for their surroundings. Occasionally, they moved away from the main team to carry out reconnaissance. Explore more at my virtual library empire. The march proceeded calmly in this way, without anything happening. As they approached Irina's village, the mercenaries and apprentice knights were relieved to arrive at last. The first signs of life appeared in the form of small isolated farms and barns, the wheat fields buffeted by a gentle breeze. When they were within 100 meters of the village, Maxime ordered them to stop so as not to frighten the villagers. They were soon spotted, and a crowd of villagers gathered outside the village gates. Maxime addressed his men. Don't forget, he whispered to his men. We'll be living with these people for 2 days, so be as nice as you were in Plauta. For the apprentice knights, pass yourselves off as mercenaries under my orders. What for, Maxime? Asked Alden curiously. It's chief, added Andrew, glaring at Alden. Alden looked slightly at Andrew. You're under the chief's orders right now, so you have to call him chief. Seeing that the mercenaries looked at him with almost menacing glances, Alden finally nodded.
What for, chief?
And we don't ask questions about the chief's orders, Andrew continued dryly. Alden knew that Andrew was doing this mainly to establish Maxime's authority, but also to annoy him so he could make fun of him later. They'd already become friends since their duel, and had sensed a good feeling between them. It's okay, Andrew, it doesn't matter. Maxime looked at Alden and explained the choice. If you declare your identity as an apprentice knight, the villagers will feel a social barrier with you, which will complicate our cooperation with them. It's not particularly annoying, but if we can avoid that kind of little hassle, it's better. After Alden nodded in understanding and asked no further questions, Maxime advanced with his men towards the village. The villagers who had emerged from their homes were casting cold, worried glances at the armed group. Although there were over 500 villagers gathered here, Maxime's 20 mercenaries accompanied by 5 powerful apprentice knights had much more momentum. Some of the peasants murmured among themselves, exchanging wary glances in the direction of the mercenaries. A middle-aged man with piercing eyes stepped forward, addressing Maximus directly, who was 1 step ahead of everyone else. What are you doing here? He asked suspiciously. Maxime bowed his head respectfully, trying to appear as calm as possible. We've received information from reliable sources that orcs will be attacking this village in less than 2 days. His words sounded like thunder to the villagers, who began to panic. Living in the south, they knew full well how much stronger orcs were than humans. But don't worry, we've been commissioned by Count Arden to protect you. At these words, a dry laugh broke out among the crowd. A burly man leaning on a pitchfork stared at him suspiciously. And with only a score of men, you think you can repel them? It looks like the Count has abandoned us. Maxime did not lose his composure in the face of the villagers' suspicion. He took another step forward, his confident gaze lingering on each of them. I understand your doubts, he replied in a firm but calm tone. But it's not just a question of quantity when it comes to facing orcs, but of quality. My mercenary squad has already faced and defeated many orcs, otherwise the Count wouldn't have sent us here. The man with the pitchfork, his features still contracting with distrust, raised an eyebrow before retorting. Easy for you to say. What are we villagers supposed to do? Hide and pray you're as strong as you say you are. Stop it, Francis, we have no choice but to trust them anyway. The village chief looked at the man with the pitchfork with disgruntled eyes. Whether it's true or not, we only have these men to protect us. Just then, Andrew intervened, his voice ringing with vibrant assurance.
No, sir. You're going to help too.
We need barricades, observation posts, and the eyes of each and every one of you. If we work together, we can block these orcs more easily. Murmurs began to break out among the villagers, some nodding their heads while others exchanged worried but determined glances. Maxime, seeing that Andrew's words had had an effect, addressed the crowd again. Within 2 days, we will turn this village into a stronghold and protect your families and your land. He added in a softer voice, intended to calm the spirits. We understand your apprehensions, but we really need each and every one of you to make this plan work. After a few moments of silence, the villagers finally accepted the help of the mercenaries and apprentice knights. They were first welcomed with a modest evening meal in various village families. There were so many villagers in this village that, even with only one mercenary per family, there were still many families who did not welcome any mercenaries. The next day, under the leadership of Maxime and his men, the village went into battle. They began by erecting barricades and preparing available weapons, while the apprentice knights helped the villagers to quickly practice the basic gestures needed to defend themselves in the event of a breakthrough. The most important thing was to make long spears, so that if the unexpected happened, the villagers would be able to defend themselves at least a little. Of course, the orcs were so powerful that it would take at least a dozen villagers armed with long spears to face just one. After spending a whole day working together, the villagers of Irina's village were less wary of the mercenaries. So much so, that they organized a big meal in the evening, much to the delight of the mercenaries, who began to enjoy these evenings with the villagers. The village filled with laughter and song around a large fire in the village center. Tired, dust-covered faces gave way to smiles, and the tension of the day gradually evaporated. It was a chance to get to know the villagers. This little event was an opportunity to get to know the villagers. For example, there was the village chief's wife, in her 50s, with sparkling eyes and a kind smile. Her name was Mira, and she was an incredibly gentle healer, known for her remedies made from simple plants and medicinal herbs she gathered herself in the surrounding forests. That evening, she circulated among the mercenaries and apprentices, checking their wounds and chatting with them as if they were old friends. She told Izo how she had once healed a soldier who had been bitten by a wolf, while joking that animals are easier to heal than men, as the latter were generally too proud to admit they were in pain. To everyone's surprise, Izo grinned slightly at this story and started talking to her. This mercenary, usually so discreet, revealed himself for the first time to be a little sociable. On the other hand, there was the man who had provoked Maxime and Andrew leaning on his pitchfork at the entrance to the village. Francis was a massive man with graying hair who was busy forging all the tools the villagers needed. He was still covered in soot and had scorch marks on his arms, signs of long years spent wielding hammer and anvil. But beneath his gruff exterior, Francis was a loving father and loyal friend, appreciated for his sound advice and sense of humor. Tonight, he exchanged stories of battles and weapon-making with Andrew, extolling the virtues of his latest blacksmith's hammer, which for him had surpassed the work of his ancestors by 3 generations. After a few drinks, he recounted how he had once forged a sword so sharp that even a child could cut an orc in half. Unfortunately, he had lost that sword, which he had made on a whim, mixed with a flash of inspiration. Eleanor, barely 20, was a farmer's daughter who raised sheep with impressive agility and vivacity. That evening, dressed in a simple linen tunic, she listened with fascination to the stories of the mercenaries. Her red hair and intense gaze captivated the attention of the apprentices, especially Alden, who almost seemed to look at her with admiration. The two stood off to one side and chatted together. Read latest chapters at my virtual library empire. It seemed that the feeling between the two was very good. Among the apprentice knights, apart from Alden, were Tomas, Theo, Lila, and Caleb. Tomas was the young man who had fought Andrew with Leo. Leo, for his part, hadn't wanted to risk his life, so he hadn't come. Theo was a slim-faced young man with piercing eyes. His discreet nature contrasted with his skills. He was a highly intelligent strategist as well as being an apprentice knight in the early stages of success. That evening, he often stood back, observing the interactions, his lips sometimes quirking a discreet smile. Until he started chatting with Tenna, who had a minor talent for intelligence. The two began to talk about many different things, including politics, finance, territory management, and war strategy. Their discussion went wonderfully well. Occasionally, villagers or mercenaries would join in, until they realized that they were not at all up to the level of such discussions. Among the apprentice knights, the only woman who had wanted to come was Lila. With her childlike face and boundless energy, she was an apprentice knight full of life, ready to protect others at all costs. She laughed out loud as she listened to Francis the blacksmith's stories, and even asked Mira to teach her simple herbal remedies if he had time. She even showed the village children how to hold a sword. When James saw this scene, he was interested and started chatting lightly with her. First about swordplay, then about other things. In particular, the two found they had something in common. They both loved the beauty of nature, and loved to take quiet walks to observe it. Their dreams were also very similar. They both wanted peace in the world, even with foreign races. For them, the world would be happy the day all races lived together in harmony. The fifth and final apprentice knight was named Caleb. He was tall and sturdy with a serious look in his eyes, but he had a tender heart and cared about everyone's safety. He was the second apprentice knight at the stage of great success, and his strength was very close to Alden's. That night, he took the time to talk to each villager. Noticing a little sadness in his eyes, Andrew couldn't resist talking to him. He learned that he had originally wanted to become a simple farmer and take over his ancestors' land to cultivate. When he learned that he had an extremely rare knightly talent, a medium-level knightly talent, he didn't feel much. His dream was to live quietly with his farm animals and continue to cultivate the land of his ancestors. But when he saw the pride in his father's eyes, and how he told the villagers that his son possessed a very high talent for becoming a knight, he could never look him in the eye and tell him that what he wanted was to be like his father. And so, in spite of himself, he had forged a new life goal. I want to protect the people who are living my dream. Francis, who had heard everything in spite of himself, was touched. Come back to the village one day, and I'll forge you a unique blade and top-quality armor from what's left of my precious materials. As the night wore on, the villagers began to sing songs from their childhood, and apprentice knights and mercenaries were invited to dance. Rudimentary musical instruments had been made by the villagers, adding to the good mood. The evening passed quietly in good spirits, until Maxime, who had been lying quietly at the foot of a tree with Laura in his arms, saw one of Tenna's brothers coming towards him in a slight panic. "What's wrong with Moron?" asked Maxime, frowning. The orcs are coming." Simultaneously, Laura gripped Maxime's hand tightly, feeling worried that if it were only the orcs arriving, Morvan wouldn't have been so panicked. He himself was a mercenary who had already experienced many battles. They are extremely numerous, far too numerous. There are far too many of them. Maxime stood up immediately, and the mercenaries, who had been keeping their wits about them because they knew an orc army was approaching, reacted immediately when they saw Maxime stand up abruptly. Everyone, whatever they were doing, stopped immediately and approached Maxime, Laura, and Moron. Izo, who had been talking to Mira, suddenly interrupted the discussion, and with a small sign of apology went over to Maxime. Andrew and Caleb also noticed the movement and glanced at each other solemnly. For his part, Alden also left Eleanor in spite of himself, sensing that the mood had suddenly changed. The villagers also noticed the movement and began to worry. Seeing the mercenaries and apprentice knights gathering in front of him, Maxime explained nothing. Everyone head for the top of the wooden ramparts built the day before. Everyone nodded, and went to the top of the ramparts, and all looked in the same direction, side by side. The villagers didn't climb to the top of the ramparts, as the mercenaries blocked their access completely, and simply asked them to take refuge in their homes. But most didn't listen, and the children and women ran home in fear, while the men armed themselves with spears made the day before. There were over 300 armed men, representing a considerable force. But facing an orc army, they would be very vulnerable, hence Maxime's order. The mercenaries' mission was to protect them, not send them into battle. "What's going on, Maxime? You could tell us now, couldn't you?" Andrew looked a little disgruntled, as did other mercenaries who didn't understand the situation. "The orcs are coming," replied Maxime simply, his gaze fixed on the nearby forest. "Yes, we already know they're coming, but why react this way?" "Because they're arriving early and in large numbers, too many, according to those doing the reconnaissance." The mercenaries frowned and looked at those on duty that night. But they shrugged their shoulders, not knowing any better. Only Moron knew the news, and really knew what awaited them. "Hey Moron, tell us what you saw." The latter was still shivering with fear, so when he noticed he was being questioned, he began to stammer, not knowing what or how to answer. "Don't ask him, it's better if you see it with your own eyes, like me," Maxime added in a firm tone, and that firm tone meant it was an order. So no one dared ask any more questions. A few hours passed and some mercenaries tried to rest on the ramparts, but not a single one managed to sleep. As dawn broke, a strange silence fell over the surrounding area. Those who had been trying to sleep jumped to their feet. Everyone anxiously scanned the nearby forest. The wind seemed to freeze, as if holding its breath. Then, the creaking of branches broke the stillness. Massive shadows appeared at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the first light of day. "They're coming." Maxime signaled the mercenaries to stand by, and a tense calm settled over the village. The villagers below also felt the tension. A ferocious roar erupted from the forest ranks of the orcs, shattering the oppressive calm that had settled in. Then came roar after roar. Silhouette after silhouette of orcs emerged from the forest. At first, there were only a dozen orcs, some 2 meters tall. Then another 20 or so appeared. Seconds later, Maxime counted over 50. By the time they reached the ramparts, there were over 200 of them. Maxime felt shivers run through his body. This was an even stronger army than the one they dodged in the valley on their way to Lappy. Maxime could count more than a dozen orcs over 3 meters tall. At this stage, Maxime could not order his men to charge from the ramparts as he had planned. What's more, all the traps he'd prepared the day before were now useless against such an army. He looked at his men and the apprentice knights. They were all trembling with fear.
But no one backed down.
Maxime knew he had to make a choice, a very difficult choice. Mercenary friends, apprentice knights, it's been an honor knowing you. Everyone looked at him bravely, ready to fight to the death. It was the only way out for them at this stage to save the villagers.
Run away.
Everyone looked at him with wide eyes. The first orcs would be arriving at the ramparts in less than 10 seconds.
Flee, all of you now.
Maxime's roaring voice echoed throughout the village. I'll delay them, take the villagers with you and run as fast as you can. Laura, usually so serene, wore a fierce expression as tears welled up in her eyes.
I'll stay with you.
No, you're leaving like all the others, Maxime replied immediately with a firm face. In the distance, Maxime could see more orcs arriving continuously. At this point there were over 500 of them. 500 orcs comparable to apprentice knights, including a dozen orcs who could take on knights. He even noticed an orc over 4 meters tall. At that size, it would take several senior knights to take him on, or even a grand knight. Tears began to stream down Laura's face. I've finally seen hope in this life, I can't lose it after finding it in such a short time. The mercenaries watched this silent scene, their faces filled with all kinds of emotions. Everyone knew what kind of relationship their leader and Laura had. The two were practically glued together all the time, and it was hard not to notice. Maxime approached Laura very closely. Their faces were literally glued together. I'll survive, I promise. Then Maxime kissed Laura for a long time, before the stunned eyes of the mercenaries and apprentice knights nearby. Read latest chapters on my virtual library empire. With the orcs running in their direction, it looked like a scene one would only see in a painting, or in a movie in the real world. Maxime moved slightly away from Laura's face. I love you. The tears on Laura's village continued to flow, she was extremely moved. It was the first time she'd felt so much happiness in her life. Maxime had never said those words before in all their years together, although it was obvious to both of them. But this was also the moment when she felt the most sadness of her life. For she was about to lose the love of her life. She knew her man was strong, but even such a genius couldn't come out alive against such an army.
How unfair was life?
A relatively simple mission for them had turned into a coffin for the love of her life. At that moment, she couldn't help but feel an immense hatred for the Count who had sent them here. As far as she was concerned, if the Count's men had done their job properly, they wouldn't be here today. For his part, Maxime didn't think he could make it out alive. He could have run away, but running away to let so many people die, he couldn't do it. I love you too. Laura murmured in a low voice, her head bowed. These words were heard only by Maxime, who smiled slightly. The next moment, however, he put on a very serious face. Go now. See to it that these thousands of villagers survive. Simultaneously, the first orc collided with the ramparts, shaking the ground beneath the feet of the mercenaries and apprentice knights.